Dominic Sable could buy entire hotels off a cliff road with one phone call, but he could not buy one full night of sleep for his son. Every night, just after midnight, 5-year-old Toby woke screaming so hard the sound ran through the whole house like broken glass. And before this story is over, a woman nobody in that mansion would have chosen on paper will do what 4 experts could not. If you stay with me, you'll hear what the child was truly seeing in the dark, and why the answer had been inside that house all along. On that particular night, the screaming started at 2:12. Sharp, breathless, terrified. Dominic was already out of bed before the second cry. He crossed the long upstairs hall barefoot, shirt half buttoned, his pulse hammering in his throat. The mansion was vast, expensive, spotless, and at that hour it felt like a sleepless mansion built only to echo fear back at itself. Lamps glowed low against the paneled walls. Far below, waves struck the rocks under the cliff in a dull, steady boom. But none of that sound mattered. Only Toby's did. When Dominic pushed open the boy's bedroom door, he found the child twisted in the sheets, face wet, small hands clawing at the blanket as if something lived underneath it.
No, 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 no! Don't let them take her!
Toby choked out, not fully awake, his little body rigid with panic. Dominic went straight to him, tried the same gentle voice he had practiced for months, the same careful touch on the shoulder, the same promise that it was all right. Daddy was here, nobody was taking anyone anywhere. It did not reach him. It never did, not in the middle of these storms. Toby's room smelled faintly of lavender spray, warm cotton, and the bitter trace of medicine that had been used too often and helped too little. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, untouched. Beside it, a row of prescribed drops lined up with military neatness, as if order itself could force peace into a child's mind. Dominic knew every stage of the episode now, and that was its own kind of torture. First the scream, then the thrashing, then the wild pleading to people who were not there. And after that, the collapse. Toby would fall into a thin, ugly sleep near dawn, only to spend the next day quiet, drained, and withdrawn, looking out windows as if the whole world had moved somewhere he could not follow. 4 child psychiatrists had already come through those doors over the past months. 4. Men and women with framed credentials, gentle office voices, expensive shoes, and careful theories about grief. They had all said nearly the same thing in different words: trauma, adjustment, sleep disruption, delayed mourning. They had offered routines, charts, breathing exercises, and then, when those failed, sedatives. The sedatives made things worse. The child's screams grew harsher. His daylight silence grew deeper. One specialist called it a difficult treatment curve. Dominic had nearly thrown him out of the house for saying it like a business inconvenience. Tonight felt worse than the others. Toby was burning with fear, but his skin was cold under Dominic's hand. The boy's eyes opened suddenly, glassy and wide, staring over his father's shoulder toward the far corner of the room, where only darkness gathered near the curtains. "Red lights," he whispered, voice ragged. "They came back." Then he buried his face against Dominic's chest and shook so hard Dominic could feel it through both their clothes. The man sat there on the edge of the bed in the half-light, holding his son, breathing in the smell of salt blown up from the sea and the warm, damp scent of a frightened child. And for the first time in weeks, something close to hopelessness crawled up his spine. He had built an empire out of failing properties, debt, and nerve. He could read contracts in minutes, spot weakness in rivals, rescue hotels from collapse. Yet here, in his own home, one small boy's terror made him feel useless. By 4 in the morning, the house had gone quiet again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives only after a storm has wrung everything out of the walls. Dominic stood alone in the kitchen while the first staff began moving in the back corridors. Coffee hissed from the machine. The air smelled of fresh grounds, yeast from the bakery ovens, and rain drifting in from the terrace doors. He had no appetite, no strength, only that sick, familiar dread of waiting for the next night. That was when Elena, the estate cook, looked up from kneading dough and said something nobody else in the household had dared say to him. "Sir, the people with certificates haven't helped your boy. I know someone else." Dominic barely lifted his head. He thought she meant another doctor, another referral, another polished stranger with a theory and a fee. But Elena wiped flour from her hands, met his bloodshot stare without flinching, and quietly told him about a young night nurse from a farm village inland. No elite training, no famous clinic, no grand resume. Just years spent sitting through long nights with children who were afraid, sick, grieving, or all three. Elena said her name was Marisol Vega. Said she had a way of listening that reached places medicine couldn't. Dominic almost dismissed it right there, until Elena added one last thing. "She won't drug him into silence," she said. "And if you're willing to hear an answer you may not like, she might tell you what your son is actually afraid of." If you want to hear what happened when Dominic finally said yes, leave a like and stay with me, because the next night changed everything. Elena's words stayed with Dominic long after the coffee in his cup had gone cold. Morning in that house always felt wrong after one of Toby's episodes. Sunlight spilled across polished floors. The staff opened curtains. Silver clinked softly in the breakfast room. And somewhere down the hill, the sea kept flashing like nothing had happened. But inside, everything bore the mark of another ruined night. Dominic's hands shook when he reached for toast he never ate. His eyes burned. Across from him, Toby sat in his small robe, hair mussed, lashes still damp from sleep, staring at a bowl of oatmeal as if it belonged to someone else's life. "Morning, champ," Dominic said quietly. The boy did not answer. He lifted one spoonful, let it slide back into the bowl, and turned his face toward the window. This was the part Dominic hated almost more than the screaming. The silence. After the panic passed, Toby moved through the day like a child listening from very far away. Too tired to play, too withdrawn to ask questions, too fragile even for tears. His teachers had stopped urging Dominic to send him back to class full-time. "He needs rest," they said. As if rest were a thing a father could simply purchase and place in a little boy's bed. Before Dominic could force down another sip of coffee, his house manager, Claire Benton, entered with a leather folder and set it beside his plate. "These are the reports you asked me to gather, sir." He already knew what was inside. Notes from the specialists, billing summaries, medication schedules, follow-up recommendations that read cleaner on paper than they ever had in Toby's room. Dominic opened the folder anyway, because tired men sometimes punish themselves by rereading failure. The first psychiatrist had blamed acute grief and advised strict bedtime structure, blackout curtains, and what he called emotional consistency. Toby had screamed through every carefully timed night. The second had filled the nursery with sensory tools, soft voices, and reward charts with silver stars. Toby had torn one chart in half after a nightmare and then stared at the paper pieces with blank shame, as if he had broken something sacred. The third came from a famous children's center and lasted exactly 10 days before suggesting medication to interrupt the cycle. The fourth had adjusted the dose, then adjusted it again when the terrors deepened. Under those drops, Toby did not sleep peacefully. He sank. He woke frightened and heavy, his speech thinner, his face dull with exhaustion. Dominic shut the folder hard enough to make the spoon on Toby's tray rattle. "I'm sorry," Claire said carefully. He gave a tired shake of his head. "For what? Finding proof that I signed off on every wrong thing?" Toby flinched at the edge in his father's voice. Dominic saw it at once and hated himself for it. He softened, reached across the table, and laid 2 fingers beside the boy's hand. Toby did not pull away, but he did not look up either. A little later, after Dominic carried him back to the morning room and left him with blocks, coloring pages, and a young attendant he barely noticed, Elena asked if she could speak to him privately. She did not come in timidly this time. Her apron still smelled of cinnamon and yeast, and there was flour on one sleeve, but her voice was steady. The girl I told you about, she said. Marisol Vega. I sent word at dawn. Dominic leaned back in his chair, rubbed both eyes, and let out a breath that sounded older than he was. You sent word before I agreed? I did. That should have irritated him. On any normal day, it would have, but there was nothing normal left in his home, only polished routines stretched over fear. Elena went on before he could answer. She worked nights in a county recovery house inland. Children after accidents, children after loss. One little boy there hadn't slept through till morning in nearly half a year. She sat with him until he did. Is she licensed? For night care, yes. For all the fancy titles your experts carried, no. Dominic looked toward the doorway, through which he could just glimpse Toby's small shoulder bent over the carpet in the next room. And you think that's supposed to reassure me? I think, Elena said, that 4 people with perfect papers left your son worse than they found him. He rose and crossed to the window. Below, the hotel terraces stepped down toward the cliff in pale stone and glass. His empire was waking up. Deliveries at the service entrance, bell carts rolling. Guests ordering breakfast with ocean views. In every building that bore his name, things ran because he demanded order. Here, in the one place that mattered most, order had failed him night after night. What makes her so certain? He asked at last. Elena's answer came without hesitation. She doesn't begin with what the child should do. She begins with what the child is trying to say. Dominic turned back slowly. That line landed where the others had not. Because Toby had been saying something. In fragments, in panic, in those awful broken cries about red lights and taking her away. Dominic had heard the words and still, somehow, had not known what to do with them. He was about to speak when a rustle came from the next room. Toby had abandoned the blocks. He was crouched on the carpet with a red crayon in his fist, drawing hard, pressing so deeply the wax snapped at the tip. Dominic walked over and knelt. On the page was a crude, boxy shape with 4 wheels and furious red streaks circling the top. An ambulance. Toby covered the paper with both hands the instant he noticed his father looking at it. And in the doorway behind them, Elena said very softly, "If you want, I can have Marisol here by sundown." By late afternoon, Dominic had said yes, though it felt less like a decision and more like the last thing a tired man says when pride has finally run out. The day dragged in that strained, brittle way days do when everyone in a house is waiting for night. Toby dozed for 20 minutes on a sofa in the morning room, woke confused, and would not let the red crayon out of his hand. Dominic tried to work from his study, but contracts blurred on the page. Every few minutes he found himself staring at the clock, listening for the front drive. Outside, hotel shuttles came and went below the ridge, and gulls wheeled over the water. But inside the house, the mood stayed tight as wire. Claire had the guest room near Toby's suite prepared. Fresh linens, a reading lamp, towels folded with hotel precision. Dominic almost laughed at the absurdity of it. If neat sheets and polished courtesy could solve this, his son would have been well months ago. Marisol arrived just before sundown in Elena's old hatchback, not in a hired car, not with hard-sided luggage, and certainly not with the polished air the other specialists had carried through that front door. She stepped out with one faded canvas duffel and a cardigan folded over her arm. Her shoes were practical, dusty from the road. Her dark hair was gathered in a loose braid that had partly slipped free by the time she reached the terrace. She paused only once, to glance up at the western windows where Toby's room overlooked the sea, as if she were already locating the child in the building. Dominic noticed that immediately. Elena met her first in the entry hall and embraced her like family. Dominic came down a moment later, every inch the owner again in a pressed shirt and dark trousers, as though good tailoring might restore the authority sleep deprivation had taken from him. Marisol turned to him, offered her hand, and said, "Mr. Sable, thank you for having me." Her voice was low, plain, steady, no breathless gratitude, no nervous chatter. He shook her hand. Her palm was warm and work-roughened, not soft. "I'm not sure thanks are in order yet. A flicker of humor touched her mouth. That's fair. He led her toward the smaller sitting room off the hall instead of his study. He did not want this to feel formal, though everything in the house tried to make formality happen on its own. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. Evening light slanted over the carpet. From somewhere down the corridor came the quiet clink of a tray being set for Toby's supper. "I'll be direct," Dominic said once they were seated. "My son is 5. He has night terrors almost every night. We've had specialists here, more than I care to count." "Elena told me some of it." "Then she also told you I wouldn't usually hire someone without a longer review." "She did." That should have embarrassed a person. Marisol only folded her hands in her lap and waited. Dominic studied her more closely. She looked younger than he expected, maybe late 20s, but there was nothing uncertain in the way she held herself. No attempt to impress, no shrinking either. "You've worked nights before?" "With children, with older patients, with people who were frightened and couldn't say why." She glanced toward the hallway. Fear sounds different depending on who's carrying it. It was an odd answer, too simple maybe, yet Dominic found himself listening harder. "And your training?" "I'm certified for overnight care and recovery support. Most of what matters I learned in homes." He leaned back, tiredness sharpening his tone. "You understand that I've already heard confidence from people with longer letters after their names." "I'm sure you have." She said it without offense. "I'm not here to compete with their letters." For the first time that day, Dominic almost smiled. Elena entered with tea and set down a small tray. Chamomile for Marisol, black coffee for Dominic, though the hour was late and he knew it was a bad idea. The steam rose between them. Marisol thanked her, then asked the question nobody else had started with. "May I see his room before I meet him?" Dominic frowned. "Not him first?" "I'd rather see where he's afraid before I ask him to trust me." That answer landed somewhere deep, in the same uncomfortable place Elena's had. Dominic stood. "All right." They walked upstairs together. The upper corridor was quiet now, washed in the gold-blue light of coming evening. At Toby's door, Dominic slowed. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because every new person who crossed that threshold carried one more chance to fail his son. Marisol stepped inside and did not perform pity. She looked, really looked, at the nightlight shaped like a moon on the far wall, at the heavy blackout drapes, at the bed placed too close to the corner, at the shelf of untouched bedtime books, at the digital monitor on the dresser with one tiny red indicator glowing even in the daylight. She crossed the room, touched the curtain fabric between finger and thumb, then crouched beside the bed until she was at a child's eye level. Dominic stayed by the door, arms folded, watching her take in details no one else had ever mentioned. Finally, she stood and turned toward the bedside table. There, beside the water glass, sat the bottle of sedative drops. Marisol picked it up, read the label, and her whole expression changed. She looked resolved. Then she set the bottle back down very carefully and asked, "When is he due for the next dose?" Dominic answered without taking his eyes off her. "Half an hour before bed." Marisol let that sit between them for a moment. From the window behind her, the last of the sun slid across the water and threw a copper glow into Toby's room. The red light on the monitor blinked again, tiny and steady. She glanced at it once, then back at Dominic. "I'd like to skip it tonight." The words were simple. The effect was not. He straightened at once. "No." "I heard you," she said calmly. "I'm still asking." This was prescribed by people with far more training than either of us. And yet your son is still terrified every night. He hated how quickly that landed. Hated more that it was true. Dominic crossed his arms and felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that had built everything he owned. Control the room. Control the terms. End the argument before it grows teeth. "You've been in this house less than 15 minutes. That's right." Her tone stayed level. And in those 15 minutes, I've seen a bed placed where shadows gather, blackout curtains that turn fear into a wall, a monitor light at a child's eye level, and medicine being used to lower the body while the mind stays trapped. She rested one hand lightly on the carved footboard. This doesn't look like rest. For a second, the only sound was the sea below the cliffs and the faint hum from the air vent above the door. Dominic took one slow breath. If I agree to this, and he gets worse, then you stop me and I leave tonight. She said it so plainly that he looked at her in surprise. No bargaining, no grand promise, just risk, offered openly. Before he could answer, there was a small movement at the door. Toby stood there in socks, one hand dragging along the frame, the other clutching the red crayon from earlier. He had changed into soft blue pajamas, but one sleeve was twisted half inside out, as if someone had dressed him while he barely noticed. His eyes moved first to his father, then to Marisol. Most new adults made the mistake of rushing toward him with bright voices. Marisol did not move at all. She just lowered herself slowly until she was sitting on the rug, not blocking the doorway, not reaching for him. "Hi, Toby," she said. "I'm Marisol." The boy said nothing. She noticed the crayon. "That red one gets down to business, huh?" A tiny crease formed between his brows. It was not a smile, but it was a reaction, which already made Dominic's chest tighten with attention. Marisol patted the floor beside her, though not insistently. "Your room has a good view. I saw the water from the hall." Toby came in 2 cautious steps, then one more. He still did not speak, but he did not retreat. He looked at her braid, at her hands, at the canvas duffel she had left by the wall. Dominic realized with a start that his son was studying her, not shrinking from her. That almost never happened. Marisol noticed the twisted pajama sleeve. "May I fix that?" Toby looked down at his own arm as if seeing it for the first time. After a pause, he gave the smallest nod. She turned the cuff right side out with slow fingers. No fuss, no cooing, just a practical little kindness. Dominic watched Toby watch her do it. Something in the room shifted. Barely, but enough to feel. When she was done, Marisol glanced toward the bedside table. "Toby, would you help me with something?" His gaze followed hers to the bottle. "I want to move a few things around before bedtime," she said. "You can tell me if I put anything in a bad spot." That word made him stiffen. Bad. Dominic saw it. So did she. Marisol did not rush to smooth it over. "Yeah," she said softly. "Rooms can have bad spots sometimes." Toby finally spoke, his voice papery from disuse. "That corner is bad." Dominic's head turned sharply toward the far side of the room, the narrow angle between the curtain and the low bookshelf. He had heard his son cry toward that area at night. He had never once heard him name it. Marisol stayed on the floor. "Thank you for telling me." Toby pointed with the red crayon, not at the corner this time, but at the little blinking monitor light. "That too." A silence opened in Dominic's chest. The specialists had called that monitor reassuring. Essential, one had said. It let the adults keep watch. But Toby's face had gone pale just looking at it. Marisol rose and unplugged the device without making a speech about it. The red blink vanished. Toby's shoulders lowered a fraction. Then she turned back to Dominic, and in front of the child she asked the question that made the whole room go still. "Mr. Sable, when was the last time anyone asked him what the red lights remind him of?" The question hung there so long that even Toby seemed to feel its weight. Dominic opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had answers for investors, for board members, for grieving relatives, for reporters who had once asked carefully worded questions after his wife died. But this was different. Toby had gone very still beside the bed, red crayon hanging loosely from his fingers, waiting without knowing he was waiting. Marisol did not look away from Dominic. She was not challenging him for sport. He could see that now. She was holding the line on something he had spent months stepping around. Finally, he said, quieter than before, "No one asked him that directly." Toby looked up at his father, then back at her. Marisol nodded once, as if a locked door had just made a small sound in its frame. "All right," she turned to the boy. "You don't have to answer tonight if you don't want to." That seemed to ease him more than any coaxing would have. He stared at the unplugged monitor, then at the bad corner, and slowly climbed onto the bed. Not hiding, just watching. Dominic stood where he was, feeling exposed in his own son's room in a way no business loss had ever made him feel. Marisol pulled the desk chair closer, but instead of sitting in it right away, she glanced around again and asked, "May I move his bed?" Dominic blinked. "Now?" "If that corner matters to him, yes, just a little." There was something almost absurd about it. An empire owner, a farm nurse, and a half-asleep child rearranging furniture at dusk because fear had chosen one patch of wall. And yet Dominic found himself saying, "Show me." Together they shifted the bed several inches away from the corner and turned it just enough that when Toby opened his eyes, the first thing he would see was the door, not the curtain shadow. The wooden legs scraped softly across the floorboards. Toby watched every inch of the movement. When it was done, Marisol asked him, "Better or worse?" He gave the smallest answer yet. "Better." That one word hit Dominic harder than it should have. So many expensive plans had produced nothing. A small change in angle, and his son could already tell the difference. Then Marisol sat in the chair and looked up at Dominic. "I need you to tell me about the night your wife left." The room seemed to lose air. Toby's head lowered at once, as if some part of him knew exactly what they were near. Dominic's jaw tightened. The smell of the sea drifted in through a cracked window, cool and clean, and all at once he was somewhere else in his mind, back in that other night. Sirens below the drive, wet gravel, voices too loud in a house that had just gone terribly quiet. He spoke carefully, each detail dragged up instead of offered. "She collapsed in the sitting room after dinner. I called emergency services. They came quickly." His throat worked. There were lights from the ambulance outside, red across the windows, across the hall. Marisol listened without interrupting. Toby came out of his room. He should have been asleep, but the noise woke him. One of the medics was carrying equipment in. Another was talking to me. I remember. He stopped and rubbed a hand over his face. "I remember thinking I had to stay with my wife. I told the housekeeper at the time to take him back upstairs. He saw more than I realized before she got to him." Toby had curled one hand into the blanket. "What did he see?" Marisol asked gently. Dominic looked at his son before answering. "The stretcher." The red lights through the open front door, his mother being lifted onto it. His voice dropped. "And me not going with him when they let him away." No one spoke for a moment. From somewhere downstairs came the muffled sound of cutlery being laid for dinner, the ordinary life of the house continuing with painful indifference. Marisol finally asked, "Did anyone explain it to him afterward?" Dominic felt the shame before he found the words. "I told him Mommy was very sick. Then, after she died, everyone kept saying he was too young, that we shouldn't be blunt, that time would help him understand." "And did time help?" He gave a humorless exhale. "You've seen the answer." Toby's voice came suddenly, thin as paper. "She went away in the red." Both adults turned to him. He was staring at the coverlet, not at either of them. "They took her and the light stayed on my wall." His breathing had gone shallow. "And Daddy didn't come." Dominic crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the edge of the bed. Toby. But Marisol lifted one hand, just slightly, asking him without words not to rush over the child's sentence. Let him finish. The boy swallowed. "If I sleep, they come back." There it was, a rule his little mind had built to keep disaster from repeating. Stay awake, keep watch, keep people from disappearing. Dominic felt something inside him crack with a terrible softness. Marisol leaned forward, forearms resting on her knees, her voice low and steady. Thank you for telling us. That was brave. Toby looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no flinch in him at all. Marisol stood slowly and reached for the medicine bottle on the nightstand. She held it in her palm, turned it once, then set it down out of Toby's reach. Tonight, she had said she wanted one chance, one night without the drops, without the false heaviness they brought. Dominic had agreed in theory. Standing there now, with his son's fear finally laid bare in words no chart had ever captured, theory felt a lot less safe. Marisol met his eyes. "If you want me to help him," she said, "I need you to trust me for the next few hours, starting with that bottle." Dominic did not answer her right away. The bottle sat between them on the nightstand, small and ordinary looking. The kind of object that should have meant safety, and had somehow become part of the fear. Toby's eyes moved from his father to Marisol and back again. Outside, evening had deepened. The sea below the cliff was turning slate-colored, and a cool draft crept through the window gap carrying salt and rain. Dominic could hear his own pulse in his ears. He was being asked to do something he had spent months being told not to do. Stop medicating, stop controlling. Trust a stranger with the one creature in his life he loved more than breath. "What do you need from me?" he asked at last. Marisol answered at once. "No drops tonight. No surprise visitors in and out of the room. And if he wakes frightened, you let me reach him before you change the air with panic." That stung a little because it was true. Dominic had been coming into Toby's room like a man rushing into fire, desperate and already afraid. A child could feel that. He knew it now. He picked up the bottle, looked at the pale liquid inside, then slipped it into his pocket. One night. Marisol gave a single nod. No triumph, no relieved smile. She just turned to Toby and said, "You heard that, sweetheart. No medicine tonight." Toby studied her for a moment, then asked in a small, worn-out voice, "Will I still have the bad dream?" "Maybe," she said honestly. "But if it comes, we're going to do it different." It was the kind of answer Dominic would never have dared give. He would have promised it away, tried to soften it, tried to sell calm before it arrived. Toby seemed to trust the honesty more than comfort. He lay back against the pillows and kept watching her. What followed felt strangely simple. Marisol asked for warm milk with cinnamon instead of the sweet sleep supplement the previous doctors had recommended. She had Elena bring a damp washcloth that smelled faintly of lavender and orange peel, then let Toby wipe his own hands and face with it, as if bedtime needed to belong to him again. She asked whether he wanted the door wide open, half open, or only cracked. He chose half. She asked whether the hall lamp should stay on. He said yes. She asked whether the heavy quilt felt safe or too heavy. He thought about that one and asked for the lighter blue blanket from the foot chest. Dominic stood near the dresser at first, useless in his own son's room, watching this woman restore choice in tiny pieces. It looked so small from the outside. A lamp, a blanket, a door angle. Yet Toby's breathing had already changed. It was still uneasy, but no longer trapped high in his chest. When supper came, Dominic carried the tray himself. Toby ate 3 bites of soup and half a roll, which was more than he usually managed after a hard night. Marisol never praised him for it like a victory. She only asked if the broth was too hot and tore the roll into smaller pieces when his fingers tired. Quiet competence unsettled Dominic in a new way. There was no performance in it, no need to be seen being kind. Later, when Toby was washed and tucked in, Marisol pulled the chair close to the bed and set her canvas duffel on the floor beside it. Dominic noticed she had unpacked almost nothing. A change of clothes, a comb, a paperback with a bent cover, a small tin object wrapped in cloth, which she did not open. He found himself wondering why she carried so little, then caught himself. It was not the question that mattered. She looked up at him. "He'll watch your face all night if you stay in the room." Dominic frowned. "You want me to leave?" "I want him to feel that bedtime is not an emergency." He stood very still. In boardrooms, people obeyed him. In this room, he kept being asked to surrender ground. But every time he did, Toby seemed to loosen by one more thread. He bent and kissed his son's forehead. Toby clutched his sleeve for 1 second, then let go. "I'll be right outside," Dominic said. Toby glanced at Marisol before he answered. "Okay." One word should not have hit so hard. Dominic stepped into the hallway and left the door half open, just as Toby had asked. From there, he could see the edge of the bed, one lamp, the line of Marisol's shoulder in the chair. He sat on the floor against the wall like a man waiting outside surgery, jacket abandoned somewhere downstairs, sleeves rolled up, listening to the house settle around him. The first hour passed quietly. Marisol did not read a story. She did not fill the room with chatter. Now and then, he heard her say something low and plain. "The curtains are moving because the window is cracked. That sound is the ice maker down the hall. Your dad is outside the door." It was a strange kind of comfort, built from ordinary facts. A little after midnight, the change came. Dominic heard it before he saw it. That sharp intake of breath, the kind that meant Toby was slipping under. He pushed himself up at once, but Marisol's voice met him from inside, calm and firm without rising at all. "Stay there." Toby had begun to whimper. Then the whimper turned jagged. The sheets rustled. A heel thudded once against the mattress. Dominic gripped the doorframe so hard the wood bit into his palm. Every instinct in him screamed to run in, gather his child, beg the fear to stop. Inside, Marisol did none of those things. She said, "Toby, listen to me. You are in your room. The door is half open. The lamp is on. I am in the chair." The bed shook harder. "Feel the blanket in your hands," she went on. "Hear the ocean. Hear me. Stay here." Then, through the rising panic, Toby cried out something he had never said before. "Her shoe fell off," he sobbed. "On the steps. Her shoe fell off." For a second, Dominic forgot to breathe. A shoe. One small, ordinary thing, and suddenly the whole night had a shape. He saw it then with sickening clarity. Not the way adults had remembered that terrible evening, but the way a child might have. Flashing red across the walls, strange voices, his mother lifted away, and one shoe slipping loose as they rushed her out, left behind on the stone by the front entrance like proof that something had broken in the world and nobody had stopped to fix it. Inside the room, Toby was half upright now, caught between sleep and panic, tears hot on his cheeks. "Her shoe fell off," he cried again, his hands bunching the blanket. "Tell them! Tell them!" Dominic started forward. Marisol got there first, though not by touching him. She moved her chair closer until it nearly brushed the bed, then anchored her voice low and even, giving the boy something firmer than comfort to hold on to. "Toby, listen to me. You're remembering. That's what this is. You're remembering the front steps." The child's breathing hitched. Dominic froze in the doorway, every muscle straining. "She had one shoe on and one shoe off," Toby gasped. "Yes," Marisol said, "that happened, and you saw it." No one had ever answered him like that. Not with denial, not with rushed reassurance. She was naming the thing that had frightened him, putting it down in the room where it could be seen. Toby's heel thudded once more against the mattress, then not again. Marisol kept going. The red lights were from the ambulance. They were outside. They are not outside tonight. Dominic could hear the ocean under her words, the soft rattle of the window latch in the wind, the rough edge of his own breath. Toby swallowed hard. His crying changed. It was still painful, still sharp, but it had less wildness in it, less of that helpless drowning sound. Then Marisol did something Dominic would remember for a very long time. She reached behind her chair, opened her canvas bag, and took out the cloth-wrapped object he had noticed earlier. From the fabric, she unfolded a small dented tin lantern, no taller than a child's forearm, painted years ago in faded blue. Tiny star cuts lined the sides. It was old, clearly loved, and wholly out of place among the tailored wealth of the room. Without ceremony, she set it on the bedside table. Toby stared through tears. "What's that?" "A night lantern," she said. "My grandmother used one when children in our house had bad dreams." She glanced toward Dominic. "May I light it?" He nodded before he even thought about it. She struck a match. The sulfur flared, sharp for an instant, then softened into warm wax and metal heat. When the tiny candle caught, gold light slipped through the star shapes and scattered across the wall in quiet points. Gentle, steady. Toby watched those pinpricks of light with the fierce attention frightened children give anything that might save them. Marisol rested one hand on the edge of the mattress, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd him. "When this lantern is lit," she said, "we tell the truth about what happened. We don't pretend. We don't guess. We tell the truth until the room feels like your room again." Dominic felt those words like a hand closing around his own shame. Because pretending, even softly, had been the rule ever since his wife died. Adults had lowered their voices, changed subjects, used careful phrases, gone vague when the boy asked direct things. They had called it protecting him. Listening now, Dominic understood something brutal. They had mostly been protecting themselves. Toby sniffed and rubbed his face with the heel of his hand. "The red came on my wall." "I know," Marisol said. "And Mommy didn't say bye." Marisol's eyes lifted briefly toward Dominic. This one belonged to him. He stepped in at last, the carpet soft under his bare feet, the lantern glow laying a fragile pattern across his shirt cuffs. He sat on the bed again, slower this time, and looked at his son with no prepared line in his mouth. "She didn't get the chance, buddy," he said, his voice rough. "She was very, very sick. She didn't leave because she wanted to go away from you." Toby's mouth trembled. "Then why didn't you come?" The question landed exactly where Dominic had feared it would. He closed his eyes for one beat, then opened them. "Because I thought I had to stay with her while they helped her. And I thought someone else getting you upstairs fast would keep you safe." His throat tightened. "I was wrong about that. I should have explained more. I should have come to you sooner." Children know when grown-ups are telling the truth. Toby searched his father's face like he was checking whether the floor would hold. Then he whispered, "I thought if I slept, they'd come back and take you too." Dominic bent over at that, one hand covering his mouth for a second before he gathered himself. Marisol did not interrupt. She held the room open while father and son stood in the middle of the ache. "No," Dominic said, steadying. "No, Toby. Sleeping doesn't make people disappear." The boy looked at the lantern again. "Can it stay on?" "Yes," Marisol said. "Tonight it stays." At some point, without anyone deciding it, Dominic ended up on the floor beside the bed, one forearm resting near Toby's blanket, while Marisol remained in the chair on the other side. The three of them stayed like that while the fear slowly came down from its highest edge. The house around them had gone deeply quiet, the kind of quiet that usually came with dread in that sleepless mansion. Tonight it felt different. Tender. Uncertain. Waiting. Toby's eyelids began to sag. Marisol lowered her voice to almost nothing. "Good. Let your body rest. If the memory comes back, we name it again." Dominic watched his son drift, tense for the usual snap back into screaming. It didn't come. Not immediately. But just as Toby's breathing finally started to lengthen, the boy opened his eyes once more and looked straight at Marisol. "There was blood on Daddy's hand," he whispered. "Why was there blood on Daddy's hand?" The question hit Dominic harder than anything else that night. For a moment, he was no longer in Toby's room at all. He was back in the front hall, kneeling on cold stone, one hand braced against the floor after trying to steady his wife as she slipped from his arms. He remembered the shouting he could barely hear, The medic bag snapping open, the metallic smell in the air, and when he looked down then, yes, there had been blood across his palm. Not much by an adult's measure, more than enough for a child. He swallowed and looked at his son. The little boy's face was pinched with exhaustion, but his eyes were fixed on him, waiting with the terrible patience children have when they sense that the answer matters. Because Mommy was hurt when she fell, Dominic said carefully. I was holding her, and some blood got on my hand. He kept his voice low, steady, simple. It scared you. I understand that now. Toby's fingers loosened from the blanket just a little. I thought you were hurt too. Dominic's whole face changed at that. The grief was still there, yes, but now something else had broken through it. The realization that his son had been carrying two fears, losing his mother and then fearing his father might vanish next. He reached for Toby's hand slowly enough for the boy to see it coming. This time, Toby let him hold it. I wasn't hurt, Dominic said. I was scared. That's different. Marisol stayed very still in the chair, letting the truth settle in the room instead of rushing to fill every silence. The small candle in the lantern burned with a soft, honey-colored light. It made the sharp edges of the furniture gentler. The stars cut into the tin trembled faintly on the wall each time the draft moved through the cracked window. Toby blinked several times, as if the effort of asking had cost him something. Why didn't anybody tell me that? The question was quiet. It was also devastating. Dominic opened his mouth and found there was no good answer. Because the grown-ups were afraid. Because they thought silence was kinder. Because they had all mistaken avoidance for protection. None of those belonged in a 5-year-old's bed. Marisol answered first, but gently, and without stealing the moment from him. Sometimes adults think if they don't say a scary thing out loud, it might feel smaller. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair, loose, calm. But children still feel it. Then they have to make sense of it alone. Toby looked at the lantern again. I don't like doing it alone. You won't, Dominic said, faster than before, more feeling in it than polish. You won't do it alone again. That was the first promise he had made in months that did not sound hollow, because now he understood what it needed to be built on. Truth. Presence. Staying in the hard moment instead of tidying it away. The boy's breathing softened by degrees. Not all at once. It came in tiny changes. A shoulder unclenched. His brow smoothed. His hand, still in Dominic's, no longer felt cold and rigid. Marisol leaned forward just enough to pull the lighter blanket up under his chin. Would you like me to tell you what happens next? She asked him. Toby gave a sleepy nod. All right, she said. Next, your body remembers that tonight is tonight, not that other night. Your father is here. I am here. The ambulance is not outside. No one is carrying anybody away. You can rest, and if the memory tries to come back, one of us will help you name it. The boy's eyes drifted shut, then opened once more. Will the shoe still be there? Dominic frowned faintly, but Marisol seemed to understand at once. In your memory? She asked. He nodded. Yes, she said. Some memories keep every little piece. That doesn't mean they are happening again. That answer seemed to satisfy him more than a false no would have. His lashes lowered. This time they stayed down. Minutes passed, real minutes. Dominic measured them first by tension, then by sound. The ticking travel clock on the shelf, the faint hiss of the candle. The ocean below the cliffs, steady and dark and far away. Toby did not bolt upright. He did not cry out. Once he stirred and frowned, and Marisol only said, You're here, and he settled again. At nearly 2 in the morning, Dominic looked over at her for the first time since the worst of it had passed. In the softened light, her face was tired, but there was no self-congratulation in it. No look of someone pleased with being right. She seemed to be listening still, to the whole room, as if fear itself had a rhythm she had learned to hear. He realized then how close she was sitting to the bed, how long she had stayed motionless so Toby would not feel watched by nerves. There was flour still caught in the seam of her cardigan cuff from Elena's kitchen, and a burn mark on one thumb that looked old. Such ordinary details, such a strange contrast against the silk drapes, the custom cabinetry, the expensive quiet of the house. Yet she belonged in that moment far more than anything money had placed there. Marisol rose at last, only enough to check the window latch and lower the flame a touch. When she turned back, Dominic whispered, "He's asleep." She gave the smallest nod, but instead of relief, something more thoughtful crossed her face. Then she bent near Toby, studying him with the care of someone reading a page that had only just become legible. After a long second, she looked at Dominic and said very softly, "This is the first time he's come out of it without being dragged awake. But tomorrow I need you to tell me exactly what happened after the ambulance doors closed." Morning came so quietly that Dominic woke in a panic. For one wild second, staring at the pale ceiling in his dressing room, he thought something terrible had happened because he had not heard screaming. Then he looked at the clock and sat upright, a little past 6. He had slept in the armchair outside Toby's room after insisting he would only close his eyes for a minute, and somehow the dark stretch between midnight and dawn had passed without the usual disaster. His neck ached. His shirt was creased. The candle smell from the little lantern still clung faintly to the hall. He was on his feet at once. Toby was still asleep. The boy lay on his side with one hand tucked under his cheek, the blue blanket pulled crooked to his shoulder, lashes still damp but peaceful. No pinched brow, no restless kicking, just sleep, real sleep, thin perhaps, but unbroken. The tiny lantern sat cold on the bedside table, its punched stars now pale in the morning light. Marisol was awake in the chair, shoes off, cardigan folded over the back, reading from the bent paperback she'd brought in her bag. She looked up when Dominic entered, and for the first time he saw tiredness under her calm. "How long?" he whispered. "Just under 4 hours after the bad spell," she said, keeping her voice low. "He stirred twice. He came back down both times." 4 hours. It should not have felt miraculous. To Dominic, it did. He stepped closer to the bed, not trusting himself to say much more. The room smelled of wax, clean cotton, and the salt air drifting in from the cracked window. It no longer smelled like fear, at least not this morning. Toby shifted in his sleep and let out one soft breath against the pillow. Dominic put his hand briefly over his own eyes. Marisol closed her book and rose. "Come downstairs with me while he's still out. I need the rest of that night." They went to the breakfast room while the house was only half awake. A maid was polishing glasses at the far end. Somewhere in the kitchen, Elena's mixers had started up, low and steady. Dominic poured coffee, then forgot to drink it. Marisol asked for hot water and took it plain. In daylight, she looked even less like the kind of help his world trusted. No carefully styled polish, no expensive watch, no institutional confidence. And yet everyone in that sleepless mansion seemed to breathe differently around her already. She sat at the long table as if she had every right to ask hard things there. After the ambulance doors closed, she said, "What happened in the house?" Dominic stared into his untouched cup. "I stood in the drive a few seconds after they left. I remember the taillights turning down the road." He frowned slightly, reaching back through shock. "Then I came inside. The front hall was a mess. One of the medics had dropped gauze wrappers. My wife's scarf was on the floor. And," he looked up, "the shoe." Toby was right. One shoe was still there. Marisol said nothing. She let him continue. "Mrs. Harrow, our housekeeper then, had Toby upstairs. At least I thought she did. When I came in, I washed my hands in the downstairs powder room because of the blood. I could hear him crying from the landing." His face tightened. "Not loud, more confused than loud." "Did you go to him then?" "No." The word came fast, full of regret. "My brother-in-law arrived. Then the family doctor called. There were arrangements, calls, decisions. I kept telling myself I'd go up in a minute." He let out a bitter breath. Minutes became nearly an hour. Marisol's fingers rested around the warm mug, still. Who spoke to Toby in that hour? Mrs. Harrow tried. Then one of my wife's cousins came up because she thought a familiar voice might help. I don't even remember who else was in the house by then. He pressed thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose. There were too many people. People bringing blankets, speaking softly, shutting doors, whispering outside rooms. She nodded slowly. Children make stories out of fragments. He saw the ambulance. He saw the blood. He saw the shoe left behind. Then he heard adults whispering, and no one gave him a clean beginning, middle, and end. Dominic leaned back in his chair, shame settling heavier now because it was no longer vague. It had shape. I failed him. You were losing your wife, she said quietly. You were not thinking like a child. Then she lifted her gaze and held his. But now you must. That landed with no softness around it, and because it was true, he accepted it. Just then, Toby appeared in the doorway, hair tangled from sleep, dragging the blue blanket behind him like a small ghost of himself. He looked dazed in the morning light, but not hollow, not flattened. Dominic stood at once. Hey, he said, unable to hide the wonder in his voice. You slept. Toby rubbed one eye and looked first at his father, then at Marisol. The stars stayed on the wall in my head. Marisol smiled just a little. Good. He padded in, climbed onto a dining chair much too large for him, and after a long pause asked the question both adults knew was coming sooner or later. Did Mama know where the ambulance was taking her? The question landed softly, but it changed the whole morning. Dominic looked at his son across the long breakfast table, at the rumpled hair, the blanket still dragging from the chair, the face that had finally known a few hours of peace. And he understood that children do not ask around grief. They ask straight through it. He set his coffee down and moved closer instead of answering from across the room. She knew people were trying to help her, he said, crouching so they were eye level. She knew they were taking her to the hospital because she was very sick. I don't know how much she understood in those last minutes, buddy, but I know this. He swallowed once. She knew she loved you, and she knew I loved her. Toby absorbed that in silence, turning the edge of the blanket between two fingers. Did she know I was upstairs? Yes, Dominic said. She knew you were here in the house. The child's mouth tightened in thought. Did she think I was bad because I cried? The words were so small, so carefully spoken, that Dominic felt a cold rush of shame all the way down his back. Marisol did not step in to save him from the answer. She stayed where she was at the far end of the table, one hand around her mug, watchful and quiet. No, Dominic said at once, with more force than before. No, Toby, she would never think that. You were scared because something scary was happening. Crying didn't make anything worse. Toby looked down. I heard Aunt Janine say I shouldn't make a scene. There it was, one more shard lodged in the child where no one had gone looking. Dominic straightened very slowly. Janine was his late wife's cousin, the same one who had drifted in and out of the upstairs hall that night, armed with perfume, tissues, and opinions nobody had asked for. In the chaos afterward, half the adults in the house had spoken over Toby as if he were furniture. Apparently one of them had spoken to him too. Marisol's gaze lifted to Dominic for only a second, but it said enough. Children remember tone as much as meaning. He took a breath and faced Toby again. She was wrong to say that. You were allowed to cry then, and you're allowed to ask questions now. The boy nodded once, not relieved exactly, but steadier. Then Marisol rose and came over with a small bowl of sliced pear Elena had set aside. She placed it near him and asked, Do you want to talk more now, or do you want a break? A break, he said after thinking. Good choice, she replied, like he had done something wise, not evasive. After breakfast, maybe we walk outside for 10 minutes. Daylight helps the body remember today is today. Toby took a slice of pear, then another. Dominic noticed before anyone said it out loud that this was the first ordinary appetite he had shown in weeks. The rest of the morning moved in a way Dominic had almost forgotten a house could move, less strangled. Toby did not cling to corners. He stayed near Marisol, though, as if he had quietly decided she belonged in the map of safe things. They went out to the east terrace, where the air smelled of wet stone and rosemary from the planters. The sea wind tugged at Toby's pajama sleeves until Elena came out with a sweater for him. Marisol let him choose whether to wear it zipped or open. Again, those tiny choices. Again, that same effect. His shoulders stayed loose. Dominic watched from a few paces back while pretending to take a work call he barely heard. Marisol never overwhelmed the child with questions. She pointed out gulls riding the updraft near the cliff face. She had Toby count the white deck chairs by the lower pool. She asked him if the morning air felt cold in his nose or only on his cheeks. By the time they came back inside, the boy's face had color in it. Later, in the schoolroom off the library, Marisol asked for paper. Not to draw the ambulance again, not to process on command. She folded 3 sheets into a little stack and said to Toby, "This is for bedtime tonight. 1 page for a memory of your mom. 1 page for something true about today. 1 page for any worry you don't want to carry alone." Dominic leaned in the doorway, listening. Toby frowned down at the papers. "I don't know how to write all that." "You can say it," she answered. "I can write if you want, or your dad can." That changed the air in the room. Toby turned slowly toward Dominic. It was a small turn. It felt enormous. "You write messy," Toby informed him. For the first time in many months, Dominic laughed. It came out rusty, surprised, almost disbelieving. That is a vicious thing to say before noon. Toby's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Close enough that Dominic's throat tightened. By early afternoon, when the child finally curled up for a nap on the window seat in the library, Marisol met Dominic in the hallway outside. The corridor was quiet except for the distant hum of vacuuming on the lower level and the faint scent of lemon polish from the maid's cart. Sun lay in long gold bars across the runner. She looked tired now in a way she had not allowed herself to look in front of Toby. "He did better than I expected," Dominic said. "He told the truth faster than I expected," she replied. "That matters." He nodded, then hesitated. "About tonight." "Yes," she said. "Tonight we don't wait for the fear to ambush him. We build the room before dark." Dominic glanced toward the library door, toward the sleeping child curled under a throw. "You mean the lantern?" "I mean the whole routine around it," she lowered her voice. "And I need you in it with me." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unsettled passed through him. Just the first faint awareness that this woman had stepped into the center of his most private grief and was asking him to stand beside her there. Then Marisol said the one thing that made him realize tonight would ask even more of him than the first one had. "When the lantern is lit," she said, "Toby is going to ask where his mother is now. And this time, you can't hide behind gentle phrases." That warning stayed with Dominic all through the afternoon. He carried it into calls he barely heard, into a meeting with 2 hotel managers he cut short, into the silence of his study, where the leather chair still seemed to belong to the man he had been before grief made his home feel unrecognizable. On his desk sat contracts, occupancy reports, expansion drafts, the machinery of the life he knew how to run. But all of it felt strangely thin next to one coming question from a 5-year-old boy. "Where is Mom now?" He had answered versions of that question badly for months. "She's resting. She's at peace. She's watching over you." Words chosen to soften pain, words offered by relatives and clergy and well-meaning friends, words that floated above a child's real fear without landing anywhere useful. Hiding inside them would fail him again. That was harder to hear. By late afternoon, Toby was in the library window seat with the little stack of folded pages Marisol had made for him. The room smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and rain beginning somewhere out over the water. Dominic paused in the doorway. Toby was dictating in a quiet voice while Marisol wrote in neat, plain printing. "Page 1, she said softly. A memory of your mom." Toby thought hard, one finger against his lip. "She put jam on my toast and then ate the corner she said was too messy." Marisol wrote it down exactly. No correcting, no improving. "Page 2, she said. Something true about today." Toby looked toward the terrace windows where the sky had gone silver. "I slept in the morning." A strange expression crossed Dominic's face at that. Pride, grief, relief, all tangled together. "Page 3? Marisol asked. The boy's shoulders rose a little. "I don't want the bad dream to think it can trick me." She wrote that too. Dominic came in then, and Toby looked up without the old flinch of being interrupted. That still startled him every time. Small changes were happening so quietly that he only noticed them when he stood still enough. "Can I see?" he asked. Toby hesitated, then handed him the folded pages. The handwriting was Marisol's, but the heart of it was unmistakably his son's. No specialist chart had ever shown him Toby this clearly. Not his fear, not his memory, not the way he was trying, in his child's way, to build order out of chaos. When Dominic looked up, Marisol was watching him from the armchair, just steadily. "Tonight," she said, "you answer simply. No speeches, no trying to be impressive." A tired laugh escaped him. "You think that's a risk for me?" "I think control is your favorite hiding place." That should have annoyed him. Instead, it made him lean back against the bookcase and exhale through his nose. "You say brutal things very quietly. It helps people hear them." For one brief second, something lighter passed between them, the beginning of ease. It flickered and vanished as Toby slid off the window seat and tugged at Dominic's hand. "Come see," he said, leading him toward the bedroom. The room had changed again. Nothing expensive had been added. In fact, some things were gone. The extra blinking gadgets had been removed. The armchair had been moved nearer the bed. The heavy drapes were tied back from the corners until full dark. On the bedside table, beside the tin lantern, Marisol had placed a small ceramic dish holding 3 objects Toby had chosen from downstairs. A shell from the terrace planter, a brass key from an old writing box, and a blue ribbon from one of his mother's gift-wrap drawers. Dominic looked at them, puzzled. "Anchors," Marisol said. Toby answered before she could explain further. "The shell is now, because I got it today. The key is Daddy, because he opens doors. The ribbon is Mom." Dominic's throat tightened so suddenly he had to turn his face for a second. At supper, Toby ate roasted chicken and mashed potatoes at the small breakfast table, instead of being coaxed through bites in the nursery. He asked 2 questions about hospitals, one about whether ambulances always use red lights, and one about whether grown-ups can be scared and still do the right thing. Dominic answered each one carefully, aware all the while that the real question was waiting for night. It came after bath, after the pages were placed in the drawer, after the lamp was turned low and the lantern lit. The candle smell rose warm and faintly sweet. Gold pinpoints scattered across the wall again. Dominic sat on the rug this time without being asked. Marisol took the chair. Toby lay under the blue blanket with one hand resting near the shell and the dish. For a little while, they stayed with smaller truths. The bad dream was a memory. The red lights belonged to then, not now. Daddy would answer if Toby called. The door would remain half open. Then the child stared at the lantern for a long time and asked it, not either adult. "Where's she now?" The room went still. Dominic felt his own heartbeat in his wrists. He could feel Marisol's silence beside him, just holding the moment open so he could either meet it or fail it. He chose, finally, to meet it. "She died," he said, the word clear and gentle in the room. "That means her body stopped working, and she can't come back to the house the way we want her to." Toby's eyes filled at once, but he did not turn away. Dominic kept going, because stopping now would make the truth feel dangerous again. Different people believe different things about where a person's spirit goes after death. I believe your mom's love is still part of us. It's in what she taught us, what we remember, how we love each other. Toby's voice shook. So she's nowhere I can visit. There was no easy bridge across that. Dominic knew it, Marisol knew it. The pain of it sat in the room like a fourth presence. No, Dominic said softly. Not the way we visit living people. Toby turned his face into the pillow and cried then, in the plain, aching grief of a child who had finally been told the shape of the loss. Dominic moved onto the bed beside him and gathered him close. Marisol did not interrupt. She let the sorrow be sorrow. After a while, Toby hiccuped out, "Then how do I tell her things?" Marisol leaned forward, elbows on her knees, voice low as candlelight. "Maybe," she said, "that's what tonight's third page is really for." Toby lifted his wet face and looked at her, and Dominic, holding his son in the lantern glow, realized she was about to give them both a way forward he had never once imagined. Dominic looked at her as if she had reached into a locked room and opened a window. Toby was still pressed against his father's side, cheeks damp, breathing uneven in the candlelit hush. The child had asked how to tell his mother things, and Dominic, for all his money and command and practiced self-control, had nothing ready that would not sound borrowed. Marisol, though, seemed to understand that children did not always need theology or polished comfort. Sometimes they needed a place to put love that had nowhere to go. She rose from the chair and crossed to the little desk beneath the window. The lantern light followed her in warm, shaky stars. She opened the top drawer, found one of the folded pages from earlier, and brought it back with a pencil. "You can tell her here," she said softly. "Anything you want. A question, something funny, something unfair. You don't have to pretend it's neat." Toby stared at the paper. "But she can't read it." Marisol sat again, closer this time. "Maybe not with eyes the way we do. But writing it means you don't have to hold it all inside your chest." She touched 2 fingers lightly to her own sternum. "And your dad can keep it safe." The boy considered that with the grave seriousness only children bring to impossible things. Then he turned to Dominic. "Will you keep it safe?" "With my life," Dominic said before he could stop himself. That answer seemed to settle something. Toby slid out from under Dominic's arm just enough to take the pencil. He gripped it awkwardly, then paused. "You write," he whispered, handing it back. "I'll tell." Dominic sat very still for a beat. All day, Marisol had been nudging him toward his son in small ways. The folded pages, the questions, the door left half open, the truths not softened beyond use. This was another of those nudges, and he knew it. He took the pencil. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. Toby looked at the lantern, not at either adult. "Dear Mom, I was mad at the ambulance." Dominic wrote the words exactly, the graphite scratching softly over paper. "And," Toby said after a sniff, "I slept a little, and I still remember your shoe." Dominic wrote that, too. His own vision blurred for a second. He kept going. "And tomorrow," Toby added, voice growing sleepy again, "I want Daddy to show me where the shoe was." There it was, a request. A step toward the place he had turned into terror. Dominic finished the line and looked up. "Tomorrow," he said carefully, "I will." Marisol held out her hand for the page, but only to fold it once and place it beneath the shell in the little dish. "There," she said. "It stays with the safe things tonight." Toby watched her do it with solemn relief, as if the room itself had just agreed to help him carry something heavy. What happened after that was so simple Dominic almost missed how important it was. No grand speech, no crash of emotion. The child yawned. Marisol asked if he wanted one more truth before sleep. He nodded. She said, Missing someone and sleeping are allowed to happen on the same night. Toby's eyes drifted shut on that sentence. Dominic remained beside the bed, one hand resting over the blanket near Toby's ankle, feeling the small warmth of him through the fabric. Marisol lowered the lantern flame a touch and adjusted the curtain gap so the room held both the nightlight stars and a sliver of real darkness beyond the glass. Something gentler between the two. Time moved strangely then. Minutes passed, but Dominic did not count them the way he used to, braced for impact. Toby's breathing deepened. Once, he murmured something about toast and jam. Once, his hand twitched toward the ribbon in the dish and relaxed again. No screaming came, no violent jerk into panic. At some point, Dominic realized he was studying Marisol instead of the clock. She had tucked one foot beneath her in the chair and folded her hands loosely in her lap. Her braid had come farther apart now, a few dark strands resting against her cheek. The cardigan sleeve had slipped back from her wrist, showing the pale mark of an old farm scar, thin and diagonal. She looked completely out of place in that wealthy room, and somehow more necessary in it than any object Dominic had ever bought. There was steadiness in her, and not the kind that came from training manuals or paid confidence. It came from use, from long nights, from having sat with pain without trying to dominate it. He became aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, of the intimacy of the moment. The three of them in the softened dark, Toby between them, trusting both. The hush after grief spoken plainly. It was not romance. It was too early, too fragile, too wrapped around the child. But something warm and dangerous had entered the edges of Dominic's attention. He looked away first. Marisol noticed, or perhaps only sensed, the shift. Her voice, when it came, was barely above breath. "You should sleep while he's down." Dominic gave a quiet huff that might have been a laugh. "I'm afraid to." "I know." Her tone held no judgment. "Then don't go far." He nodded. He rose carefully, knees stiff from the rug, and looked down at Toby's sleeping face. There were tear tracks still drying at the corners of his mouth, but his brow was smooth. That alone felt almost impossible. At the door, Dominic paused and turned back. "Marisol." She looked up. "Thank you," was all he said, because anything longer might have broken in his throat. Her answer was simple. "Tomorrow may be harder than tonight." Dominic frowned slightly. "Why?" She glanced toward the folded note beneath the shell, then at the sleeping boy. "Because tomorrow he'll want to see the front steps in daylight. And some memories get louder before they let go." The next morning, Toby asked to see the front steps before anyone had even finished breakfast. He asked with one hand twisted in the hem of his sweater and his eyes fixed on the orange juice beside his plate. But he asked. That mattered. Dominic felt the request go through him like a draft through an old house. This was the place the child's fear had been circling for months, never in daylight, never with words around it. Marisol only nodded, as if he had requested something ordinary. "All right," she said, "but we go slowly, and you get to stop whenever you need." The morning was cool and bright when they stepped outside. The sea below the cliff was pale blue glass, and gulls wheeled high over the drive. The front entrance looked almost insultingly normal in daylight. Wide stone steps, black railings, large planters with clipped rosemary and white flowers. The brass handles on the main doors shone. There was no ambulance, no shouting, no red light cutting the walls. Just morning. Just stone still damp from dawn mist. Toby stopped at the top step. Dominic stayed on one side of him, Marisol on the other, neither crowding him. The child looked down the sweep of steps toward the gravel curve of the drive. His little face tightened. For a second, Dominic thought he might turn and run back inside. Instead, Toby pointed. "Was it there?" Dominic followed the finger. Third step down, left side. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's where the shoe was." Toby stared at the spot for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did somebody pick it up?" Marisol glanced at Dominic, inviting truth again. Yes, he said. I think Mrs. Harrow picked it up later that night and brought it inside. Where is it now? That question caught Dominic off guard. He had not seen that pair of shoes in months. He remembered a box in the dressing room closet after the funeral. He remembered avoiding it. I believe it's still in your mother's things. Toby nodded as if storing that information away for later. Then, very slowly, he took one step down. The stone was cool under his socks. Dominic almost moved to steady him, but Marisol gave the smallest shake of her head. Let him own it. Toby took another step, then another. At the third one, he stopped and crouched, laying his palm flat against the stone. It's just cold, he whispered, sounding surprised. Marisol knelt a few feet away. That's what it is today. He looked up at her. It doesn't feel bad. Good, she said. Sometimes a place gets mixed up with a memory. Coming back helps untangle them. Toby stayed there for another minute, then stood and looked down the drive. Where did you wash your hand? Dominic pointed toward the side hall window visible through the open front door. In the downstairs powder room. Toby absorbed that too, curious. The grief had not left him, but curiosity had finally found a way to sit beside it. They went inside and followed the path of that old night together, not dramatically, not like a ritual performance, just the three of them moving through the house in daylight. The front hall, the powder room, the bottom of the staircase where Toby had cried and no one had explained enough. Marisol had him touch the wallpaper, the banister, the cool porcelain sink. What does it look like today? She kept asking. What does it smell like now? Lemon soap, clean towels, furniture polish. Nothing haunted, nothing flashing. Each answer gave the house back a little more. By noon, Toby was tired from the effort of it, but not shattered. He fell asleep on the sitting room sofa with his head in Dominic's lap, one shoe half off, a detail so ordinary it nearly undid him. Dominic sat very still, afraid to disturb either the child or the strange peace settling over the room. Marisol stood at the window for a moment, looking out toward the hotel terraces far below, where staff carts moved in neat lines between kitchens and guest wings. You built all that? She asked quietly. Dominic glanced down toward the cliffside hotel buildings, sun striking their glass. Most of it. One failing property first, then another. Then I forgot how to stop. Her mouth softened at one corner. People from where I grew up don't forget how to stop. They forget how to leave. He looked up at that. It was the first thing she had said about herself that wasn't purely practical. You left, he said. Yes. She kept her gaze on the view. My town is flat land, dust in summer, mud in winter, everybody knowing your grandmother's business before you do. Good people, kind people. But if they decide who you are at 10 years old, they still think they're right when you're 28. She paused, then added, Night work was the first thing that belonged only to me. Dominic had no ready answer to that. He only watched the light touch the side of her face, the loose strands near her neck, the plain steadiness of her in a room full of expensive things. Gratitude was there, of course. So was admiration. And somewhere under both, something quieter had begun to wake up. Something he did not dare name. That evening, Toby asked for the folded pages without being prompted. He dictated one memory about jam on toast, one truth about the cold step, and one worry that sounded smaller than the night before. Then, when Marisol reached for the lantern and Dominic moved automatically toward the door, Toby frowned. No, the boy said, already under his blanket. You stay too, Daddy. Dominic stopped. Marisol looked from father to son, then gently shifted the chair to make space on the other side of the bed. And as Dominic sat down beside the lantern glow for the first time by invitation instead of desperation, Toby lifted his face from the pillow and asked the one question neither adult had prepared for. If Mom loved this house, why did everything feel so scary after she died? The question left Dominic silent for a beat longer than Toby liked. The boy noticed at once. Children always do. His small fingers tightened on the blanket, and the lantern glow trembled over the shell and ribbon in the dish beside his bed. Marisol did not rush in to answer for him. She only sat with that same stillness she brought to every hard moment, giving him the space to say something honest instead of something polished. Dominic drew a slow breath. "Because when your mom died," he said quietly, "everyone in this house was scared. Me most of all." He kept his eyes on Toby's face. And scared grown-ups make rooms feel different. They whisper. They rush. They stop laughing. They forget to explain things. A house can start to feel frightening when the people inside it are hurting. Toby thought about that. "So the house didn't do it?" "No," Dominic said. "The house didn't do anything." Marisol added gently, "Places keep the feeling people leave in them. Then, if no one changes the feeling, it stays." That seemed to make sense to him in a way bigger explanations would not have. He turned his head toward the door, toward the hall where so many bad nights had begun, then back to the two adults beside him. "It feels different now." Dominic felt that one in his chest. "What feels different?" Marisol asked. Toby yawned before answering. "You both stay." It was such a plain sentence. Yet after months of panic, specialists, silence, and failure, it sounded almost sacred. Dominic looked across the bed at Marisol. The lantern lit one side of her face and left the other in soft shadow. Her eyes dropped first this time, and she adjusted the blanket near Toby's shoulder, as if that small task needed all her attention. The child fell asleep not long after, his hand resting near the folded note to his mother. He did not jerk awake. He simply drifted, breathing deeper by degrees, while Dominic stayed seated on the rug and watched the impossible happen again. When Marisol finally lowered the lantern flame and motioned for him to step into the hall, the corridor outside felt warmer than it had any right to. The old draft was still there, the distant hush of the sea below the cliff still rose through the windows, and somewhere downstairs a dishwasher thudded softly in the service kitchen. But the dread that had ruled those upper rooms for months had loosened. "He's beginning to separate the memory from the room," Marisol said. Dominic kept his voice low. "Because of you." "Because of repetition," she answered, though without false modesty. Truth repeated enough times starts to sound safer than fear. He leaned one shoulder against the wall, more tired than he had words for and more awake than he had felt in weeks. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make something difficult sound almost simple." Her mouth curved faintly. "It usually isn't simple. It just has to be plain." For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway lamp cast a soft pool of light between them. Dominic noticed the loose strand of hair against her neck, the tiredness in the set of her shoulders, the candle scent still clinging to her cardigan. She noticed, perhaps, that he had stopped standing like an employer issuing instructions, and had started standing like a man who did not know what to do with gratitude once it grew too large. He said, "You should rest." "So should you." A small silence passed between them. Not awkward, not easy either. Something new had entered the house along with the healing, and both of them seemed aware of it without daring to name it. The next few days changed the rhythm of the mansion. Toby still asked questions, sometimes at breakfast, sometimes halfway through putting on his shoes, sometimes while staring at clouds from the terrace. But he was no longer sealed shut by daylight. He spoke more, ate more. Once, to Elena's delight, he asked for jam on toast exactly the way his mother had made it. The nighttime routine took shape around those 3 pages, the little dish of objects, and the warm, star-cut lantern. Dominic joined it every evening now. Sometimes Toby asked him to write. Sometimes he wrote one crooked word himself. Sometimes he only wanted to sit in the glow and hear one memory about his mother and one true thing about the day. And Dominic began to rediscover his son in those ordinary minutes. He learned Toby hated the heel ends of bread, that he still miscounted after 17 when he was excited, that he remembered the tune his mother used to hum while buttoning his coat, though he only knew half of it. He also learned that Marisol never treated these moments like miracles to be admired. She treated them like life returning where it belonged. That, more than anything, unsettled him. On the fourth evening after the visit to the front steps, Dominic came home earlier than usual from the lower hotel offices and found Toby and Marisol in the conservatory. Rain tapped the glass overhead. The room smelled of damp earth, basil, and the citrus tree Elena kept near the far wall. Toby was sorting seed packets into crooked little stacks, while Marisol read the names aloud. "Mint," she said. "Mint," Toby repeated. "Time." "Tine," Marisol smiled. "Close enough." Dominic stood in the doorway longer than he meant to. The scene was so gentle, so domestic, it reached places in him that business, grief, and exhaustion had left numb. Toby looked up and brightened. "Daddy, we're making a garden plan." "A garden plan?" Dominic echoed, setting down his briefcase. "For the kitchen beds," Marisol said. "He thinks strawberries should go beside the rosemary." "That is because strawberries are happier near good smells," Toby explained solemnly. Dominic laughed before he could stop himself. "A bold agricultural position." Toby giggled. A real one this time, quick and clear. And then, before Dominic could step farther into the room, Claire appeared in the doorway behind him, her expression careful in the way it only became when bad timing wore expensive shoes. "Sir," she said quietly, "Ms. Celeste Arden has arrived. She says she'll be staying the week." Claire's announcement chilled the room so quickly that even Toby felt it. The boy's grin faded. His fingers slipped off the seed packet he had been sorting, and he looked from Dominic to Marisol with that sharpened little alertness children get when adult weather changes without warning. Dominic's jaw tightened before he could stop it. Celeste Arden was his late wife's older sister, a woman who wore grief like polished armor and believed appearances were part of moral duty. She had not visited often since the funeral. When she did, the house always seemed to sit straighter. "Did she say why?" Dominic asked. Claire kept her voice careful. "Only that she expected you to be home. Her luggage is already being taken to the Blue Guest Suite." Of course it was. Celeste never arrived in doubt. She arrived as if expected by the architecture itself. Marisol set the last seed packet down and rose without haste. "Should I take Toby upstairs?" "No," Dominic said too quickly, then moderated his tone. "No, not yet." He did not want the first image Celeste referred to be absence or secrecy, or a child hurried away as if the truth of the house required hiding. But neither did he want her sharp eyes on Toby before he could prepare for it. He rubbed a hand over his mouth, thinking. Toby solved it in his own way. "I don't want Aunt Celeste to hug me too hard." Marisol glanced down at him. "Then you can say so." The boy looked doubtful. Dominic crouched in front of him. "And if you don't want to say it, I'll say it for you." That seemed to help. Toby nodded once and moved closer to Marisol, not clinging, just choosing his place. They found Celeste in the west drawing room, where the late sun turned everything expensive into theater. She stood near the mantel in a cream travel suit without a wrinkle in it, gloves in one hand, a silk scarf arranged with maddening precision at her tongue. She was beautiful in the cold, old money way that made other people check their own posture. Her blonde hair was immaculate. Her expression, when she turned, was not unkind, but it was measuring. "Dominic," she said, stepping forward to kiss his cheek as though they had seen each other last week instead of months ago. "You look dreadful." "Good evening to you too, Celeste." Then her gaze moved to Toby, and something softer did appear. Not warm exactly, but real. "There's my brave boy." Toby pressed himself against Marisol's side. Celeste noticed that before she noticed Marisol's face. That, more than anything, altered the air. "And who is this?" she asked. Dominic answered before Marisol could. "This is Marisol Vega. She's been helping with Toby." Celeste's eyes flicked over the simple cardigan, the practical shoes, the lack of social polish. Helping how? With nights, Dominic said. Ah, a tiny pause. Another specialist? No, Marisol said calmly. A night nurse. Celeste's brows lifted just enough to be insulting if one was paying attention. She extended a hand anyway, and Marisol shook it without shrinking. Dominic watched the exchange like a man listening for the first crack in lake ice. Toby tugged at Dominic's sleeve. You said you'd tell her about the hug. That, oddly, was what broke the tension first. Dominic looked at Celeste. He doesn't want a tight hello. For half a second, she looked almost offended. Then she recovered and knelt gracefully, keeping her distance. Then I shall greet you from right here, she said to Toby. Hello, darling. Toby gave a wary little wave. Celeste rose and turned back to Dominic. May we speak privately? The drawing room doors were still open. The sea beyond the terrace flashed silver blue. Somewhere downstairs, a trolley rattled across tile. Dominic knew better than to pretend this request was casual. He asked Claire to take Toby and Marisol to the conservatory for Coco. Toby resisted for a moment, then went when Marisol promised they could bring the garden plan. Only after they were gone did Celeste release the expression she had been holding. A night nurse, she repeated, without so much as a proper introduction beforehand. Dominic folded his arms. She's helping Toby. So I gathered. Celeste moved toward the drinks cart but did not pour herself anything. What I have not gathered is why the child now appears attached to a stranger I've never heard named before in a household that used to understand discretion. The old irritation rose in Dominic at once. He appears calmer. That should interest you more than whether you heard her name in advance. It interests me very much, Celeste said coolly, which is why I'm asking. Dominic did not answer. Celeste studied him for another long second, and he recognized the look. She was comparing the house she remembered to the one she had walked into. The changed atmosphere. The missing edge of panic. The fact that he had come home before dark. The fact that Toby had chosen to stand beside a woman who clearly did not belong to their circle. I assume this has something to do with the anniversary gala next month, she said at last. The board has been trying to reach you about guest confirmations, and the memorial presentation for Lena still needs approval. At the name of his wife, something tightened in him all over again. Celeste went on. That event matters, Dominic, not just commercially, publicly, symbolically. There will be donors, press, long-term partners. People watch how a family carries itself after loss. There it is, he said. There what is? The real reason you're here. A beat passed between them. Celeste set her gloves down on the table with exquisite control. I came because I heard from two different people that this house has been reorganized around an unvetted employee with unusual influence over my nephew. Before Dominic could answer, a small voice came from the doorway behind them. I'm not her nephew, Toby said, standing there with Marisol a step behind him. I'm her Toby. For one suspended second, nobody in the drawing room moved. Then Celeste turned with controlled slowness and looked at Toby as if the child had spoken in a language she had not expected him to remember. It was that he had said it at all. Toby, who for months had hidden inside silence and night terrors, was now standing in the doorway correcting an adult. Dominic felt a fierce, private flash of pride. Toby seemed to feel it too, because he took 2 small steps farther into the room. Marisol stayed just behind him, one hand loose at her side, not guiding him, not shielding him, simply there. Celeste's gaze flicked to that detail, and Dominic recognized the exact moment her concern sharpened into suspicion. My dear boy, she said at last, recovering her smoothness. Of course you're Toby. He frowned. Then don't say it like I'm not here. The room went very still again. Claire, still in the doorway, lowered her eyes and disappeared with the instinct of experienced staff. Dominic almost did the same in spirit. Celeste, however, had too much discipline to show embarrassment for more than half a breath. She moved toward Toby and this time stopped at the distance he seemed to prefer. "You're right," she said. "I should have spoken to you, not about you." Toby seemed to weigh whether that counted. Finally, he nodded, then reached back and found Marisol's hand without even turning around. Celeste saw that too. The rest of the evening carried a new kind of strain. Not loud. Celeste was not a woman who fought and raised voices. She fought in observations, in emphasis, in who was acknowledged and who was politely looked through. At dinner, she asked Toby several careful questions about his lessons, complimented the soup, and referred to Marisol twice as the nurse without using her name. Toby answered when he felt like it, not when invited. Dominic heard the silence around the omissions as clearly as if they had been spoken aloud. Later, after Toby was bathed and the lantern glow had once again softened his room, Dominic found Celeste waiting for him in the downstairs sitting room with a brandy she had poured but not touched. "So," she said, "this is serious." He stayed standing. "What is?" "The attachment." It irritated him at once. "He trusts her." "He depends on her," Celeste corrected. "That is not the same thing." Dominic said nothing. Celeste crossed one elegant leg over the other. "I came because I was worried about you. Now I'm worried about the boy as well. He is still grieving. Vulnerable children fasten themselves to certainty, especially if it arrives wrapped in simplicity." The pause before the last word was surgical. "Say what you mean," Dominic said. She held his gaze. "I mean that homes like this can confuse people about their place in them." The room seemed to contract. Rain tapped at the far windows. The lamp beside Celeste threw a warm pool across the rug, but there was nothing warm in her tone now. "She has helped him," Dominic said, forcing himself not to harden too quickly. "That should matter more than your ideas about place." "It matters," Celeste replied. "Of course it matters. But healing a frightened child is one thing. Reshaping the household around herself is another." Dominic stared at her. "That's what you think is happening?" "I think," she said, "that grief makes men impressionable in ways they later regret." There it was. Not yet a direct accusation, but close enough that he felt heat rise under his collar. The worst of it was that some small, hidden part of him understood why she had noticed the shift. He had noticed it too. The way he listened for Marisol's footsteps in the hall. The way Toby settled faster when she entered a room. The way the whole mansion seemed to take its first full breath in months around her. That did not make Celeste right. It made her dangerous. "She is an employee," Dominic said, and the sentence sounded colder than he intended. Celeste watched him carefully, as if listening for the places where his certainty thinned. "Then treat the situation like one. Before the staff start talking. Before the board notices odd changes in your schedule. Before the anniversary gala turns into an occasion for whispers." He frowned. "What does the gala have to do with any of this?" "Everything," she said. "It is next month. It marks the hotel group's founding season. Your wife's memory is still attached to that event in the public mind. You will be watched. Toby will be watched. And if some unknown rural nurse has become central to the house, people will ask questions that do neither of you any favors." Dominic let out a tired breath through his nose. "You came armed for this conversation." "I came prepared," she corrected. Upstairs, faintly, he could hear Toby's bedtime voice through the vent shafts, talking. Talking. Even that soft little sound hardened his position. Whatever Celeste believed, whatever society noticed, whatever the donors at the anniversary gala might murmur over champagne, the child was sleeping. The child was speaking. The child was returning. "I will not unsettle him to satisfy appearances," Dominic said. Celeste set down the untouched brandy. "Then at least let me observe before you decide how wise this arrangement is." That word again, arrangement. As if a living, breathing rescue had been an administrative experiment. Before Dominic could answer, Marisol entered the doorway. She had probably come to ask something simple about tomorrow's breakfast or Toby's morning schedule. Instead, she walked into a room bristling with concealed steel. "I'm sorry," she said, stopping at once. "I didn't realize." "No," Celeste said smoothly, rising to her feet. "Please, since you are evidently so important here, perhaps this is the perfect time." Marisol's expression did not change, but Dominic saw the alertness settle into her shoulders. The house had gone quiet around them. Somewhere, far off, a service door closed. Rain slid down the glass. Celeste smiled the way one smiles before setting down fine china that may or may not survive the table. "I was just asking my brother-in-law," she said, "whether he has any intention of checking your references beyond the cook's opinion." Rain traced thin lines down the tall windows behind her, and the room carried that quiet, expensive hush old houses seem to cultivate when something unpleasant is about to be said. Dominic felt the air tighten in his lungs. Celeste had made the attack sound polite, which somehow made it uglier. Marisol clasped her hands lightly in front of her. "You're welcome to ask me directly, Ms. Arden." Celeste's smile barely moved. "Very well. Where did you train?" "In overnight care and recovery support. Most of my work was in homes and a county recovery house inland." "And before that?" "I helped raise younger siblings. Then I worked nights wherever people needed someone steady more than they needed someone impressive." That answer should have sounded defensive. In Marisol's voice, it didn't. It only sounded true. Celeste angled her head. "You understand this household is not casual. Toby is not a trial case. Dominic cannot simply bring in anyone the cook finds reassuring." Dominic stepped in then, his tone sharper. "That's enough." But Marisol gave the smallest shake of her head. She still wanted the question faced. "She's right about one thing," she said. "He isn't a trial case. That's why I refuse to continue the sedatives." Celeste turned fully toward her now. "You overruled physicians?" "I stopped repeating what was making him worse." The silence after that was brittle. Dominic saw the exact moment Celeste understood there had been real change in the house. Her eyes moved from Marisol to him, then to the doorway as if she could still sense Toby somewhere upstairs. "And you allowed this?" "I did," he said. "And if the child had spiraled?" "He didn't." Celeste's jaw tightened. She disliked outcomes that made argument harder. At that moment, Toby's voice floated faintly from upstairs through the vented corridor. He was calling for water, just sleepily. The sound cut through all three adults. Without thinking, Marisol turned toward the hall. Without thinking, Dominic did too. Celeste noticed that instant shared instinct. "I'll take it up," Marisol said. Dominic nodded. "I'll come." "No!" Toby called again, louder this time. "Mari!" The room changed. It was a small thing, a nickname forming on a tired child's tongue, but it landed with force. Celeste looked at Dominic slowly, and he knew exactly what she had heard in that single syllable. Familiarity, reliance, belonging. Marisol excused herself and went upstairs. Dominic stayed because leaving now would feel like retreat. Celeste waited until her footsteps faded. "So," she said quietly, "it's worse than I thought." His temper flashed. "Careful." "No, Dominic, you be careful." She moved closer, lowering her voice to keep the argument elegant. "I have watched families after loss for longer than you think. The child latches on. The widower confuses relief with devotion. The staff romanticize the rescuer because she succeeds where money failed. It happens. This is not gossip material for you to categorize. It becomes gossip the minute others notice what I noticed in under 10 minutes. He stared at her. Celeste softened her tone, which almost made it more dangerous. "I'm not accusing her of anything yet. I'm warning you about appearances, attachments, and dependency. Toby needs healing, yes. He also needs order, stability, clear roles. Dominic let out a humorless breath. You think order is what was missing? We had order. We had schedules, prescriptions, blackout drapes, expert routines. We had so much order my son forgot how to breathe in his own bed. That finally hit her. Not enough to convince her, but enough to make her step back. When Marisol returned, she carried the empty water glass and the calm of someone who had stepped into a child's room and restored the temperature in under a minute. He's fine, she said. Celeste looked straight at her. I'm sure he is. Any other woman might have taken that as permission to leave. Marisol didn't. She set the glass down and met Celeste's gaze with quiet steadiness. You're worried about influence, she said. I understand that. But Toby doesn't need less truth right now. He needs more of it, spoken clearly by the people who love him. For the first time, something openly cold entered Celeste's expression. And you consider yourself one of those people already? Dominic felt the floor shift under the conversation. Marisol answered with care. I consider myself responsible while I'm here. That was the right answer. Professional, clean. It should have eased things. Instead, perhaps because of the restraint in it, Dominic felt a strange disappointment move through him before he could stop it. Celeste caught none of that, or perhaps too much. She turned back to Dominic. The anniversary gala is in 3 weeks. I intend to stay long enough to make sure this household does not embarrass itself before then. She picked up her gloves from the side table. And I would strongly suggest that Miss Vega remember she is staff. Marisol's face stayed composed, but something in the room sharpened all the same. Celeste moved toward the door, then paused just before leaving. One more thing. Tomorrow afternoon, I'd like Toby with me in the South Garden for an hour. Alone. I want to see how much of this new confidence is genuine, and how much depends on who's standing beside him. Upstairs, almost on cue, Toby cried out again. Not screaming this time, just frightened enough to call one name. Mari? The sound of Toby calling for her ended the conversation more cleanly than any adult could have. Marisol turned at once. Dominic moved with her, but Celeste's final proposal stayed in the room behind them like perfume after a difficult guest had left. An hour alone in the South Garden. A test dressed up as concern. Dominic already disliked it before he had even answered. Upstairs, Toby was sitting up in bed with the blanket twisted around his waist, just unsettled. The lantern still glowed low on the table. Its little star shapes shivered on the wall with each movement of the candle flame. I dropped the ribbon, he said as soon as they came in, pointing to the floor beside the bed. That was all. No terror. No spiraling memory, just a tired child whose safe arrangement had slipped out of place. Marisol picked up the ribbon and laid it back in the dish. There. Crisis managed. Toby gave a sleepy, serious nod as if this had indeed been grave work. Dominic sat on the edge of the bed and tucked the blanket straight, while Marisol checked the window latch. It was such a small, domestic movement between them that neither spoke for a second afterward. The room carried beeswax, salt air, and the faint, clean smell of Toby's bath soap. Peaceful things. Real things. Is Aunt Celeste mad? Toby asked into the quiet. Dominic and Marisol exchanged a glance. No, Dominic said carefully. She's worried in a very stiff way. Toby considered that. She smells like church flowers. Marisol bit back a smile. Dominic did not manage to. That is a terrible thing to say about your aunt, he murmured. But true, Toby said, already half asleep again. After they settled him, Dominic stepped into the hall with Marisol and closed the door to that familiar half-open angle. For a moment, they both just listened to make sure Toby's breathing stayed even. It did. Then Dominic said, lower than before, You don't have to let her inspect you like a servant at market. Marisol folded her arms lightly, leaning one shoulder against the wall. That isn't what worries me. What does? She wants time alone with him. Her gaze stayed on the line of light under Toby's door. If she keeps the tone she used downstairs, she could pull him right back into watchfulness. Dominic knew she was right, and that knowledge irritated him almost as much as Celeste herself. Then the answer is no. Marisol looked over at him. If you refuse too fast, she'll turn it into proof that I'm controlling access. You aren't. I know that. You know that. She doesn't want to know it. He let out a breath through his nose. The old instincts in him wanted to solve this the way he solved boardroom problems. Pick the strongest position, announce it cleanly, shut down interference. But family did not move like business, and children certainly did not. Marisol seemed to understand that with maddening ease. What would you do? He asked. The question surprised both of them a little. She answered after a beat. I'd let Toby have the visit, with clear edges, short, daylight, somewhere open, and I'd make sure he knows beforehand that if he wants to leave, he gets to leave. Dominic stared at her. You'd trust her with him after tonight? I'd trust him more than she expects. That answer landed deeper than he liked, because once again, she was seeing the child he still sometimes forgot to see clearly. The next morning, the house woke under a low gray sky. Celeste appeared at breakfast in pearl earrings and perfect posture, as if the previous evening had been nothing more than a mild scheduling disagreement. Toby arrived in a green sweater, hair still damp from being combed, and paused when he saw her already seated. Dominic watched closely. Celeste set down her coffee and, to her credit, adjusted her approach. Good morning, Toby. Morning. No tight hugs, she added, almost dryly. That won her the tiniest upward flicker at one corner of his mouth. Breakfast moved cautiously. Toby ate scrambled eggs and a piece of toast. Celeste asked whether he still liked the lemon biscuits she used to bring at Christmas. He said yes, but only the soft middle part. Marisol remained near enough to help pour juice, far enough not to hover. Dominic took in every glance, every pause, every moment Toby's fork slowed. The child was not free of nerves, but he was not shutting down either. When the meal ended, Celeste rose and smoothed her napkin. If the weather holds, I thought perhaps the south garden after luncheon. Toby looked immediately at Dominic, then at Marisol. Here it was. Dominic crouched beside him. You can go if you want, and if you want to come back in 10 minutes, you come back in 10 minutes. You don't have to stay to be polite. Marisol added, and if your tummy or chest starts to feel tight, that means you check in with yourself, not push through. Celeste listened to all of this with a face trained carefully away from reaction. Toby nodded. Can I bring the shell? Yes, Marisol said. Good idea. So the terms were set. That should have eased Dominic. It didn't. The entire morning, even while he forced himself through hotel paperwork and a conference call with the events team about the anniversary gala, he remained half inside the coming hour in the garden. By early afternoon, the clouds had lifted enough for pale sun to touch the clipped hedges. The south garden smelled of wet earth and late roses. It was an elegant space, more formal than the terrace or kitchen beds, all gravel paths and iron benches and old white stone warmed by brief light. Toby stood at the entrance with the little shell in his fist. Celeste, composed and gracious, held out a hand toward the path. Shall we? He took one step forward, then stopped and turned back to Marisol. Will you still be here when I come back? He asked. The question caught Marisol in the center of her chest. Not because she doubted the answer, she didn't, but because Toby had asked it in front of Celeste, in front of Dominic, and in that small, open way children do when they hand you their whole fear without defense. The south garden lay just ahead, washed in pale light after rain, the clipped hedges dark green and glistening. The shell was warm in Toby's fist. Everything depended on what she said next. Yes, Marisol answered, bending to his height. I'll be here when you come back. Toby searched her face for one beat longer, then nodded. Only then did he turn toward Celeste and allow her to walk with him down the gravel path. Dominic watched them go with an expression that belonged on a man sending his child across a border. Celeste kept her posture perfect, her steps measured to Toby's smaller ones. She did not reach for his hand. That, at least, was something. 10 minutes, Dominic said under his breath. Marisol folded her arms against the morning chill. If we hover at the hedge, he'll feel it. I know. He didn't sound like he liked knowing it. So they stayed by the terrace doors instead, near enough to see the top of Toby's sweater moving between rose bushes, too far to hear words clearly. The air smelled of wet leaves and damp stone. Somewhere below the cliff, service carts hummed toward the hotel kitchens. Inside the mansion, breakfast dishes were being cleared. Life, indifferent as ever, went on. At first, the garden visit seemed harmless. Celeste pointed at blooms. Toby crouched to look at a snail trail shining on a low wall. Once he even laughed, a brief sound the wind carried back to them. Dominic's shoulders dropped half an inch. Then Celeste sat on the white iron bench under the magnolia and turned Toby toward her. Marisol saw the shift first. She's asking something. Dominic stepped forward instinctively. Marisol touched his sleeve. Wait. Toby stood still for a moment, shell in both hands. Celeste said something else. Even from this distance, Dominic could read the polished insistence in the angle of her chin. Toby's body changed almost instantly. His knees locked. His shoulders rose. He stopped looking at the flowers and started looking at the gravel. Marisol did not hesitate now. Go! They crossed the lawn together. By the time they reached the bench, Toby's breathing had gone tight and shallow. Celeste was still seated, calm as a hostess. Really, Dominic, we're quite all right. No, he said sharply, dropping to one knee in front of his son. What happened? Toby's fingers closed harder around the shell. He looked at Marisol, not his father. She asked if I would still sleep if the lantern wasn't there. Celeste lifted one brow. I asked whether the improvement belonged to him or to the ritual. It's a fair question. Marisol crouched on Toby's other side. And then? The child swallowed. Then she said, brave boys don't need objects. There was the injury. Small to an adult. Huge to a child who had only just learned safety could live in a room. Celeste's tone cooled. I said dependence should be reduced, not fed. Dominic rose so fast the bench legs scraped the gravel. You do not get to run experiments on my son. Celeste stood as well, all refinement and offense. Do not be theatrical. I was testing resilience. He is 5. He is also the heir to a public family that cannot be organized forever around bedtime props and sentimental indulgence. Toby's face crumpled at the word indulgence, though he surely did not fully understand it. He understood the tone. That was enough. Marisol stepped in before the argument could scorch him further. Toby, look at me. Her voice came low and steady. What is true right now? He blinked hard. I don't like this garden anymore. Good. What else is true? The shell is in my hand. Yes? Daddy's mad. Dominic almost laughed, but the anger in him was too hot. Marisol continued. And? After a second, Toby whispered, I want to go inside. That's enough, she said, and rose. Visit over. Celeste stared at her as if she had overstepped beyond repair. You don't dismiss me. Marisol did not answer that. She took Toby's hand and started back toward the house. Dominic followed close beside them. The gravel crunched sharply underfoot. Behind them, Celeste's voice came clipped and precise. You are proving my point for me. Dominic turned halfway. Then your point belongs in another house. Inside, Toby went straight to the morning room and curled into the corner of the sofa, shell still in hand, breathing unevenly. Something smaller, but dangerous in its own way, a fresh crack in a place still trying to heal. Marisol sat on the rug nearby, just keeping her voice soft and practical. The lantern was upstairs, out of reach, but she did not mention it immediately. Dominic remained standing for one moment too long, furious in that useless adult way that comes after a child has already been hurt. Then he turned and strode into the hall where Celeste had just entered, gloves snapping against her palm. "You will not speak to him like that again," he said. She met the fury head on. Someone must think beyond tonight's comfort. He was not uncomfortable until you decided to teach him a lesson. Celeste's eyes flashed. "And what exactly are you teaching him? That every fear deserves an artifact? That every attachment should be indulged because it makes a room softer for you?" That last line landed where she intended it to. Dominic went still, because now she was no longer only talking about Toby. From the morning room, Toby called out suddenly, voice wobbling, but clear enough to cut through the corridor. "Mari, can we light it before dark?" Marisol answered Toby before either adult argument could stain the room any further. "Yes," she called back, keeping her voice even. "We can light it before dark if you need to." From the morning room came a small exhale of relief, the kind only a child makes when someone has not argued with his fear. Dominic closed his eyes for 1 second. Celeste, standing across from him in the corridor with her gloves still in hand, looked at the ceiling as if appealing to a higher court. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. Dominic did not lower his voice now. "Then your meaning is the problem." She drew herself up. "I am trying to prevent dependency. You are trying to win a moral point over a frightened child. He was not frightened until he was taught to need a ritual object." Dominic let out a short, disbelieving breath. "No, he was frightened long before that. The difference is that now he tells us." That struck closer than she liked. He saw it. But Celeste had lived too long inside dignity to surrender a point cleanly. "What happens when she leaves?" she asked. "What then? Have you thought beyond the immediate comfort she provides?" The question hung there because it cut in two directions at once. Dominic heard the obvious meaning, Toby's healing. He also heard the other one, the one that made his chest tighten before he could control it. What happens when she leaves? He hated that Celeste had stumbled onto a truth he had barely allowed himself to name. Marisol's presence had become structural, not decorative, not temporary in feeling, even if temporary in contract. She had moved into the shape of the household so naturally that the idea of her absence now felt like the removal of a beam. Before he could answer, Marisol appeared from the morning room. Toby had settled with Elena and a mug of warm milk. Marisol had heard enough to understand the line of argument. "She's right to ask that question," she said quietly. Dominic turned to her. "Don't." "No, listen." Her face was calm, but there was weariness in it now, and something more guarded. "If Toby begins to believe safety only exists when I'm standing in the room, we haven't finished the work. We've just changed the shape of his fear." Celeste's expression sharpened with vindication. Dominic almost resented Marisol for giving it to her, though he knew she was still being honest. Marisol went on before either could interrupt. "That's why I said we could light it before dark. Not because he must have it, but because after the garden, his body needs a reminder that the safe routine still belongs to him. Then we widen it again when he's steady." Celeste crossed her arms. "You speak as if you run this house." Marisol met her gaze. "No, I speak as the person who sits with your nephew when he wakes shaking." Silence. Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly at the word nephew. Dominic almost smiled despite himself. That afternoon the routine was adjusted. No hiding it, no apology for it. Toby helped light the lantern while sunlight still reached the curtains. He placed the shell back in the dish himself and chose a new object for the third space beside the ribbon and key. A smooth acorn from the south garden, proof that he had gone and returned. Marisol called it something from the hard place that came back with you. Toby seemed to like that. Dominic joined them on the rug. Celeste remained at the doorway at first, arms folded, watching as if observing a foreign custom she was not ready to respect. But when Toby asked her, very unexpectedly, "Do you want to hear page 1?" Something in her face gave way. He dictated a memory of his mother laughing when a pie crust collapsed at Thanksgiving and claiming it was rustic on purpose. Dominic wrote it down. Toby smiled while saying it. Even Celeste's mouth softened. "Your sister did say that," she murmured before she could stop herself. Toby looked up. "You remember?" "Of course I do." For the first time since her arrival, she stepped fully into the room without tension leading her. That evening, after Toby fell asleep early and deeply, Dominic found Celeste in the blue guest suite with her jewelry laid out beside an open travel case and her phone balanced on a stack of anniversary gala schedules. The room smelled of expensive powder and pressed linen. Through the balcony jobs, the sea glimmered black under cloud breaks. "I'm not apologizing for protecting him," she said before he even spoke. "I didn't come for an apology." She looked up from the papers. "Then why did you come?" Dominic stood near the window, hands in his pockets, too tired for posturing. "Because you were wrong today, and because part of me understands why you're afraid." That got her attention. He looked out toward the hotel below, where a few terrace lights still glowed. "You think if this house changes too much, I'm betraying Lena? Or replacing her too fast? Or letting the wrong person become essential?" Celeste was quiet long enough for the silence to become an answer. Dominic turned back. But the house had already changed. It changed the night she died. We've all just been pretending we could freeze it there and call that loyalty. Celeste's eyes shone for the first time, though her posture stayed perfect. "And what if I don't trust the person reshaping it? Then trust the child who is sleeping again." That was the closest either of them had come to the center of things. Late that night, after Celeste's suite had gone dark and the staff corridors quieted, Dominic passed Toby's room and saw the thin line of lantern glow still slipping under the door. He stepped in to lower it and stopped. Toby was asleep, one arm flung over the blanket, peaceful. Marisol was asleep too, curled on the little window bench beneath the curtains, one hand still loosely holding the folded notebook of Toby's pages against her chest, as if she had meant only to sit a moment and had lost the battle to exhaustion. Her braid had come half undone. The candlelight made the room tender in a way that caught Dominic off guard. He moved carefully toward the bench, meaning only to take the notebook before it slid to the floor. But as he reached for it, Marisol stirred, opened her eyes, and in that confused, unguarded half-second between sleep and wakefulness, she reached for his hand. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. Marisol's fingers had closed around Dominic's hand with the blind trust of someone half asleep, and the warmth of that small contact went through him far too quickly, far too deeply. The notebook pressed against her chest. The lantern burned low. Toby slept on, untouched by any of it. Then Marisol woke fully, saw whose hand she held, and pulled back at once. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice rough with sleep. "There's nothing to apologize for," Dominic said just as quietly. But there was. Not in the act itself, in what it revealed. The room had become too intimate for pretense. Marisol looked down, smoothing the notebook as if its bent edge needed urgent correction. Dominic took one careful step back because he knew she did. Outside the window, the sea wind brushed the glass. Inside, the candle gave one soft flutter. "You should sleep in a real bed," he said. "So should you." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You keep saying that, and you keep ignoring me." He almost answered with something lighter, something dangerous in its ease. Instead, he reached past her to lower the lantern flame another fraction. Their shoulders came close enough for him to catch the clean scent of soap and beeswax in her hair. Neither of them mentioned it. When he finally left the room, he carried that brief touch with him like a secret he had no right to keep. Morning stripped the moment of none of its power. Dominic was at his desk earlier than usual because resolve had finally found shape. He called Claire first, then the family office attorney, then the private household manager. No grand speeches, just instructions. Marisol's temporary trial status was to be rewritten. Her position would be made formal, clear, and properly protected. Not helping with nights, not some vague favor in exchange for Elena's recommendation. She would be retained for Toby's emotional care and overnight stability, with full authority over the bedtime structure they had built, and with terms that could not be casually undermined by guests, relatives, or staff gossip. When Celeste came into the breakfast room in dove-gray silk and found him already there with papers spread beside his coffee, she knew at once that something had shifted. "You look alarmingly decisive," she said. "I am." She sat without asking what that meant, which was wise of her. Dominic slid one page across the table. It was not for her signature. It was for her understanding. "Marisol's role is being formalized," he said. "Her work here is no longer temporary in the loose sense you found so offensive. She answers to me, and her place in Toby's routine is not open for household debate." Celeste read the page, jaw tightening one elegant degree at a time. "This is disproportionate." "No, yesterday was." She set the paper down. "You mean to institutionalize a dependency because I questioned it once? I mean to protect a healing process from people who think pressure builds character in grieving children." That landed. Celeste looked up sharply. "You are being unfair." "Good," he said, and surprised himself with how calmly it came out. "You were unkind." Silence spread between them, broken only by the faint clink of cups from the pantry beyond. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, less polished, more tired. "I loved my sister too," she said. Dominic's expression softened, but not enough to surrender the point. "Then love Toby in a way he can survive." She looked away first. By the time Toby came down, hair crooked and one sock half turned, the argument had cooled into something more usable. Celeste did not apologize in words. That was not her way. But when Toby hesitated at the doorway, she said, "I handled yesterday badly," and let that be the whole offering. He studied her, then nodded once and climbed into his chair. Marisol arrived a moment later with the morning pages tucked under one arm. She looked composed again, though Dominic noticed she never quite met his eyes for the first minute. He respected that. Toby, mercifully, did not notice anything except breakfast and the small acorn he had decided belonged permanently in the dish upstairs. The day moved gently after that. No confrontation, no hidden test. Celeste kept her distance, though not coldly. Dominic stayed home through the afternoon and worked from the library, while Toby built paper forts from delivery boxes Elena had saved from the kitchen. Marisol moved between them with that same quiet usefulness that no longer felt like service alone. Once, when Toby demanded that his father crawl inside one of the ridiculous cardboard tunnels, Dominic did it without checking the time. He heard Marisol laugh under her breath from the window seat, and the sound stayed with him longer than it should have. That evening, bedtime came almost peacefully. The notebook received one memory, one truth, one worry. The lantern was lit. Toby asked no questions about ambulances, no questions about blood, no questions about death. He only listened while Dominic told him a story about his mother burning toast and claiming the smoke alarm was too dramatic for breakfast. Toby giggled into his blanket. Marisol adjusted the curtain gap and turned back toward the bed. That was when Toby asked, sleepy and serious, "Can the light stay in here even on nights when I'm not scared?" Toby's question made both adults look at the little lantern in a new way. Marisol was the one who answered first. "Yes," she said softly. "It can stay even on good nights." Toby's eyes drifted toward the tin stars glowing on the wall. "Then it won't just be for bad stuff." "No," Dominic said, understanding before he finished the sentence. "It won't." That mattered more than either of them said aloud. For weeks, the light had been a bridge across panic, grief, memory, and the jagged places in the house. Now, Toby was asking to keep it as part of ordinary life, belonging. He slept almost at once after that. The next days, then the next week, changed the house in quiet increments. Toby still had questions, of course. Grief did not leave like a guest politely collecting its coat. It lingered in odd places. At breakfast, he might suddenly ask whether his mother had liked storms. In the car, he might wonder if hospitals had gardens. Once, halfway through buttoning his school cardigan, he asked if dead people could be remembered wrong. But the questions came in daylight now, not only from the dark edge of sleep. And the nights no longer ruled them. Sometimes Toby wanted the lantern lit. Sometimes he only wanted it on the shelf where he could see it. Sometimes he asked for the notebook and dictated 2 lines to his mother before bed. Other nights, he yawned halfway through brushing his teeth and forgot all about it until Dominic tucked him in. The old cycle of dread had weakened so much that the staff stopped moving around the upper floor, as if every sound might trigger disaster. Elena hummed again while cooking. Claire stopped lowering her voice in the hall. Even the rooms seemed brighter, though nothing visible had changed except the people inside them. Dominic changed too. He began leaving the hotel offices earlier. He took breakfast with Toby instead of reading reports over cold coffee. He learned that if he asked one true question after supper and then stayed quiet, his son would often answer with 3. He also found himself rearranging his work around the house's evening rhythm, not the other way around. A board member complained once on a call that he had become impossible to pin down after 5. Dominic ended the call and went outside to help Toby and Marisol stake tomato vines in the kitchen beds. The air that evening smelled of wet leaves and crushed basil. Toby was wearing one of Dominic's old baseball caps turned sideways over his ears. Marisol knelt in the dirt with twine around her wrist, sleeves rolled to the elbow, explaining that plants leaned where they trusted support. Toby said that sounded like people. Dominic, tying clumsy knots beside them, looked up at her at exactly the same moment she looked at him. The glance lasted one breath too long. Neither said anything. Toby, thankfully, was busy lecturing a worm about boundaries. Celeste noticed the changes too, though she stopped commenting on them with open contempt. After the garden disaster, she kept more distance. She remained watchful, of course. She would always be watchful. But there were small surrenders. One afternoon, Dominic found her in the breakfast room, listening while Toby recited a list of things his mother used to say when she burned toast. Celeste was actually smiling. Another evening, she passed the nursery doorway, saw the lantern on the shelf, and kept walking without a word. The real proof came a week later. Toby had been invited to a schoolmate's birthday sleepover at a nearby family cottage. A month earlier, the suggestion would have been absurd. Dominic had nearly said no on reflex, but Toby wanted to go. Marisol said the fear would not shrink unless real life was allowed back in. So they prepared. 1 page in the notebook before he left, 1 shell in his overnight bag, no lantern. Just a promise that if he felt scared, he could ask the host father to call home. Dominic spent the whole afternoon pretending he was not waiting for disaster. He failed at pretending. He checked his phone every few minutes. He wandered from study to terrace to kitchen and back again. At 6, he asked Claire if the ringer was on. At 7, Elena shoved a bowl of stew at him and told him to sit down before he wore a trench in the floorboards. At 8, Marisol found him in the hall outside Toby's room, staring at the empty bed. "He's not there," she said gently. "That observation is not nearly as comforting as you think." She laughed then, a low, warm sound that loosened something in his chest. By 9, no call had come. By 10, still none. The house was unusually quiet without Toby's footsteps, questions, and abandoned socks. Dominic did not know what to do with the silence. He was beginning to realize how thoroughly fatherhood, once rediscovered, refused to be set down neatly. At 10:30, his phone finally buzzed. He answered so quickly he nearly dropped it. The host father sounded amused. "Just wanted to let you know he's asleep." Asked 1 question about whether the moon can see through curtains, then passed out with a slice of birthday cake still in his hand. Dominic closed his eyes. When he hung up, Marisol was standing at the far end of the corridor, reading his face before he spoke. He's asleep, Dominic said. I figured. He didn't call for us. That us slipped out unannounced. Marisol heard it. So did he. Something passed between them then. Just the undeniable awareness that Toby's healing had built a strange new country between them, and both had been living in it for some time. He's ready for more of life, she said quietly. Dominic looked toward the silent bedroom, then back at her. And what are we ready for? Marisol went still. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the entry hall began to strike 11, each chime deep and measured through the now peaceful house. Neither of them moved. Neither looked away. Then Marisol drew a slow breath and said, barely above a whisper, "That depends on whether you're asking as Toby's father or as a man who already knows the answer." The clock had finished striking, but the question Marisol asked still seemed to hang in the hall. Dominic could have answered too quickly. He had spent years learning how to do that, how to take a room before anyone else could define it, how to shape uncertainty into a clean sentence and stand inside it as if it had always been true. But this was not a boardroom, and the woman in front of him had spent weeks teaching his son, and by extension him, that the truth only worked if it was spoken before it hardened into performance. So he answered slowly. "I'm asking as both," he said. Marisol's face changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, she was too careful for that. More like a tension that had been held for too long, finally admitting it existed. "That's what I was afraid of," she said. He nodded once. "I know." No one moved. The corridor felt narrower than it had a minute before. Below them, somewhere in the kitchen wing, Elena laughed at something, a warm sound floating up through the quiet house. It made the moment feel even more intimate. Life was continuing around them, ordinary and unaware, while something irreversible stood still between them. Dominic looked toward Toby's empty room, then back at her. "I should have said this badly by now, or too fast, or in the wrong room. I've managed none of those things only because every time I came close, Toby needed us more than I needed to speak." Marisol let out a faint breath. That was the right choice. It may also have been cowardice. "No," she shook her head. "It was restraint. There's a difference." He almost smiled. "You are kinder to me than I deserve." That's not always true. That did draw a small smile from him, and something in her answered it before she looked down. Dominic's voice lowered. "I know exactly what this is supposed to look like from the outside. A wealthy widower, the woman who helped his child, the house growing dependent on her. Celeste is not wrong about how people tell stories when they want them ugly." Marisol folded her arms lightly across herself, just bracing against what she already knew was coming. "And that matters." "Yes," he said. Then, because anything less would be a lie. Less than it did. She looked up sharply at that. He went on before he could lose the courage. "You came here because my son was suffering. You steadied him. You steadied the whole place. Somewhere in that, without my permission and certainly without my planning, I started waiting for your footsteps in the evening. I started measuring the day by whether you were in it. That is not gratitude anymore, and pretending it is would insult both of us." For a second, she said nothing at all. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with every lantern-lit night, every folded page, every moment Toby had asked for her before sleep, every glance Dominic had looked away from too slowly. Then Marisol spoke, and her voice was so quiet he had to lean in slightly to hear it. "Do you think I don't know?" The words landed like heat under the skin. He drew a slow breath. "Then tell me what you do know." She looked past him for an instant, down the dark hall toward the rooms that had changed them both. "I know that when Toby sleeps through the night, I feel relief first, and then I listen for whether you heard it too. I know I have started staying in the kitchen after he's down just to hear you come in for tea. I know your son trusts me, and that should make everything cleaner than this." Her mouth tightened briefly. "Instead, it makes it harder." Dominic did not interrupt. He barely seemed to breathe. Marisol lifted one shoulder, a small, helpless motion from a woman who usually had none. I also know I am not naive. I know what people like Celeste would say. Maybe worse, what some part of you might one day say when grief turns into embarrassment, and embarrassment needs a target. His expression changed at once. No. You can't promise that. I can promise myself. That's different. Yes, he said, stepping closer by half a pace. It is. The nearness between them sharpened everything. The quiet, the smell of night air coming through the stairwell window, the warmth left over from their son's sleeping room clinging to their clothes. Dominic had not touched her. He was aware of not touching her the way a man is aware of a fire not yet crossed. I don't want to hide behind Toby forever, he said. And I don't want to drag you into something that confuses him either. But I can't keep pretending nothing has happened between us. It has. Even if all we have done is survive the same nights. Marisol closed her eyes for the space of one breath, then opened them again. You say that now because the house is soft, because your son is healing, because I've become part of the routine that saved him. No, Dominic said, and this time the word came with a steadiness that stopped her. I say it because tonight he slept elsewhere, and the silence in this house still led me to you. That broke through. Marisol's hands, still folded across herself, loosened. She looked at him with a kind of naked honesty that was more intimate than any touch. Then yes, she whispered. I know the answer too. The hallway seemed to narrow to the space between them. Dominic could have crossed it then. So could she. Both knew it. Both held still from respect for everything that had brought them here, and everything that could still be damaged if they moved carelessly. Below, a floorboard creaked. Somewhere, a door shut softly. The ordinary house returned around them piece by piece. Marisol stepped back first. Tomorrow, she said, voice barely steady, we need to pick Toby up from the cottage, and you have 3 calls with the anniversary gala committee, and Celeste will notice if either of us looks like we forgot how to lie. Dominic almost laughed, though it came out rougher than that. You're asking for one more night of restraint. I'm asking, she said, for us not to turn something real into something reckless. He nodded. It was the only answer worthy of her. She started to turn away, then paused. Dominic, he looked up. If you still mean all of this when the gala comes, when people are watching, when the house is bright and loud and full of judgment, her throat worked once. Then ask me again in that world. And before he could answer, before he could tell her he already would, the front gate intercom buzzed through the sleeping house. Claire's voice crackled over the hall speaker, tense enough to erase all softness at once. Sir, there's a man at the gate asking for Miss Vega by name. The man at the gate turned out to be Marisol's older brother, Mateo. He stood in the rain with a battered truck idling behind him and a hat crushed between both hands, looking painfully out of place against the clipped hedges and ironwork of the estate. Dominic watched from the hall as Marisol stepped outside to meet him under the portico. They spoke in low, urgent voices. Mateo was only worn and embarrassed, carrying the smell of wet road, engine oil, and open fields into a house that had almost forgotten such things. When Marisol came back in, her face had lost all color. My mother's been asking for me, she said quietly. And the village has decided I've stayed away too long. She tried to smile and failed. Mateo says people are talking about me, about place, about what they imagine. Celeste, who happened to be standing at the foot of the stairs, said nothing at all. She did not need to. Her silence looked too much like agreement. For 2 days after that, Marisol moved through the house with the same tenderness as always, but a distance had entered her. Dominic felt it in every room. Toby felt it most of all. The child began checking, in small, frightened ways, whether she would still be there by supper, by bath time, by morning. Then came the anniversary gala, the first big public event Dominic had hosted since his wife's death. The hotel terraces blazed with light. Strings played under glass. Donors, executives, and old family allies drifted through the house with polished grief and expensive smiles. Celeste, immaculate in midnight silk, found Marisol near the service corridor just as Toby's bedtime had been settled upstairs. Her voice stayed low, but not low enough. "You've done very well for yourself," she said. "A grieving millionaire, a vulnerable child, and suddenly you're indispensable. Some women would call that luck. Honest women would call it ambition." Marisol went still as if struck. Dominic heard enough of it from the entrance to cross the room before his own judgment caught up. He did not ask for context. He did not negotiate. In front of guests, board members, and the sister who had policed his life in the name of dignity, he said, clear enough for the room to hear, "The only person in this house who rescued my son when money, medicine, and reputation failed him is the woman you just insulted. If anyone here mistakes her for an opportunist again, they can leave now and take their donation with them." The silence that followed rang louder than the quartet. It should have solved everything. It didn't, because humiliation leaves a bruise even when someone defends you. Before dawn, Marisol had packed her duffel. Dominic found her in the side hall by the staff entrance, coat on, notebook in hand, eyes swollen from a night she had clearly not spent sleeping. "I won't stay where Toby might hear those words and think love always comes with a price tag," she said. "I won't let him build safety on top of shame." Dominic tried to answer, but Toby answered first. Barefoot in the doorway, hair mussed, lantern clutched against his chest, he looked so small that it hurt to see him. "If you go now," he whispered, "the dark will think it was right." That broke the last thing still standing in Dominic. He knelt in front of his son, then rose and turned to Marisol with no guests, no board, no sister to perform for. "Stay because I love you," he said. "Stay because he loves you. Stay because this house is no longer honest without you in it. I can fight gossip. I can fight family. I can fight my own fear. I am done asking you to stand outside the life you saved." Marisol pressed one hand over her mouth, then lowered it and answered with tears already falling. "Then don't ask me to stand outside it anymore." By spring, the anniversary lights were a memory, and the house had become something nobody would have believed during those months of screaming. Toby slept with the lantern unlit on his shelf, there because he wanted it near. Celeste, chastened by time and by the plain fact of a child restored, stopped calling Marisol the nurse and started asking whether Toby's school shoes still pinched his heel. Dominic ran his cliffside hotels with the same ruthless intelligence as before, but people in the lobby now knew him as the owner who left investor dinners for school plays and once postponed a strategy call because his son needed help writing 3 crooked lines to his mother. And Marisol, she never tried to become ornamental in that world. She wore mud on her cuffs from the kitchen beds, kept the notebook in the top drawer beside the bedtime pages, and answered Toby's questions with the same clear voice that had first brought him back from the red lights. Some houses are not repaired by replacing what was broken. Sometimes they begin to live again when someone opens a window, names the fear out loud, and leaves one small light where a child can find it without asking. On summer nights, when the sea breeze moved through Toby's curtains and the old floorboards answered softly under safe footsteps, the little tin lantern sat on its shelf catching moonlight in its punched stars, and the room no longer belonged to what had once happened there.